Preface of Our Little Austrian Cousin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. Preface. In this volume I have endeavored to give my young readers a clearer and a more intimate knowledge than is usually possessed of the vast territory known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is a collection of provinces united under one ruler, and which is, strange to say, the only country of importance in the world that has not a distinctive language of its own, since the various races, German, Slav, Magyar, and others, each speak their own tongue. The northeastern provinces, Galicia and Bukovina, have not been considered in this book, owing to the fact that they are included in Our Little Polish Cousin, and, for a similar reason, Hungary and Bohemia have been omitted, as each is the subject of an earlier volume in the Little Cousin series. The book, consequently, is chiefly devoted to Austria proper and Tyrol, but the other provinces, including Dalmatia and Bosnia, are not neglected. The publication of Our Little Austrian Cousin is most timely, since the Balkan War, now drawing to a close, has occupied the attention of the world. The Balkan states lie just to the south of the Austrian Empire, and Austria has taken a leading part in defining the terms of peace which the great powers of Europe insist shall be granted by the Balkan allies to the defeated Turks. Our Little Austrian Cousin can well be read in connection with Our Little Bulgarian Cousin and Our Little Servian Cousin, describing two of the principal Balkan states, which volumes have just been added to the Little Cousin series. Among others, I am especially indebted to Frau H. E. Palmer for much information concerning country customs in Upper Austria. End of Preface. Recording by Jule Niedermeyer. Chapter 1 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A visit to Old Vienna. "Hurrah!" shouted Ferdinand, as he burst into the living room, just as his mother was having afternoon coffee. "And what makes my son so joyful?" asked Frau Müller, as she looked up at the rosy cheeks of her young son. "Hurrah, mother! Don't you know, this is the end of school?" "So it is," replied the mother. "But I had other things in my head." "And, do you know," the child continued, as he drew up to the table where the hot coffee emitted refreshing odors, "you haven't told me yet where we are to go." "No, Ferdinand, we have wanted to surprise you. But help yourself to the cakes." And the mother placed a heaping dish of fancy Kuchen before the lad. Ferdinand did not require a second invitation. Like all normal boys, he was always hungry. But I doubt very much if he knew what real American boy hunger was, because the Austrian eats more frequently than we, having at least 5 meals a day, 3 of which are composed of coffee and delicious cakes, so that one seldom has time to become ravenous. "But, mother," persisted the child, his mouth half filled with Kuchen, "I wish I knew. Tell me when we start. Will you tell me that?" "Yes," answered his mother, smiling. "Today is Wednesday. Saturday morning we shall leave." "Oh, I just can't wait. I wish I knew." "Perhaps father will tell you when he comes," suggested the mother. "Do you think you could possibly wait that long?" "I don't believe I can," answered the lad frankly, "but I suppose I shall have to." That evening, when Herr Müller returned from his shop, Ferdinand plied him with questions in an effort to win from him, if possible, the long-withheld secret. "Well, son, there is no use trying to keep you in the dark any longer. Where do you guess we are going?" To see Cousin Leopold in Tyrol. Well, that's a very good guess, and not all wrong either. But guess again. Oh, I can't. It must be splendid, if it's better than visiting Cousin Leopold. Well, it is better, continued Herr Müller, for not only are we going to pass a few days with your Tyrolese relations, but we are going to a farm. The boy's face fell visibly. To a farm? He exclaimed. Why, Uncle Hofer has a splendid farm in Tyrol. That won't be very new to me, then? It won't, ejaculated his father, a trifle amused. You wait and see, my boy. This is not to be a tiny farm of a few acres, creeping up the mountain on one side and jumping off into a ravine on the other. We shan't have to tie this farm to boulders to keep it from slipping away from us. And Herr Müller chuckled. Then it isn't in the mountains? No, it isn't in the mountains. That is, not in any mountains that are like the Tyrolese mountains. But there will be acres and acres of this farm, and you will be miles away from anyone. You will see corn growing, too. You have never seen that in Tyrol, my son. No, answered the child. After a few moments' silence, he added, Will there be any young folks, father? Don't let that trouble you, Ferdinand. Where there is an Austrian farm, there are many children. Hurrah for the farm, then! Shouted Ferdinand, much to the astonishment and amusement of his parents, who were unused to such impulsive outbursts. But Ferdinand Müller was a typical boy, even though he had been reared in the heart of the city of Vienna, where the apartment houses stand shoulder to shoulder and back to back, with no room for play-yards or gardens even. The outside windows serving the latter duty, while the school building on weekdays and the public parks on holidays serve the former. Austrian children are never allowed to play on the street, but, as if to make up to their children for the loss of play space, the Austrian parents take them, upon every available occasion, to the splendid parks, where are provided all sorts of amusements and refreshments at a modest sum. Father, asked the lad, after a few moments' silence, during which he had sat thinking quietly, when shall we start? Saturday morning, my son. I believe your mother has everything in readiness. Nicht wahr, meine liebe Frau? He asked, as he glanced over his paper at his wife. Oh, mother, do say you are ready, pleaded the child, who, for all his 12 years and his finely developed body, was yet a boy and impulsive. Yes, I am all ready, she replied. And for the rest of the evening, silence descended upon the boy, his small brain being filled with visions of the coming pleasure. When Herr Müller returned to his home the following evening, he found a letter, postmarked Linz, awaiting him. Hello, he said, half aloud. Here's word from our friend Herr Runkel. Wonder if there's anything happened to upset our plans. Oh, father, please don't say it, pleaded the boy. I shall be so disappointed. Well, cheer up, replied his father. There's better news than you thought for. We shall leave on Saturday morning as planned. But tomorrow Herr Runkel's sister from the convent will come to us. He asks us to take charge of her, as the sisters find it very inconvenient this year to send an escort with her, and, as we are coming up in a day or two, perhaps we would not mind the extra trouble. Oh, father, won't it be fine? How old is she? I believe about your age. Friday morning, Frau Müller and Ferdinand jumped into a fiacre and drove to the railroad station to meet Teresa Runkel. She was a fine-looking child, with round, rosy cheeks, quite tall, with the fair complexion, sunny hair, and soft, Austrian blue eyes that makes the women of that land famed for their beauty. She was overjoyed at this unexpected pleasure of spending a day or two in the city of Vienna, which she had never seen, although she had passed through several times on her way to and from the convent. She enjoyed the brisk drive to the tall apartment house in the Schwanengasse, and she fairly bubbled with chatter. "After luncheon, my dear," observed Frau Müller, "we shall have Herr Müller take you about our city, for Vienna is vastly different from Linz." Herr Müller joined the party at luncheon at 11 o'clock, which was really the breakfast hour, because Austrian families take only coffee and cakes or rolls in the early morning, eating their hearty breakfast toward the middle of the day, after which they rest for an hour or two before beginning their afternoon duties. At 2 o'clock the three were ready for the walk, for Frau Müller was not to accompany them. Joseph, the portier, an important personage in Viennese life, nodded Abend to them as they passed out the front door of the building, over which he presided as a sort of turnkey. No one may pass in or out without encountering the wary eye of Joseph, who must answer to the police for the inmates of the building as also for the visitors. And this is a curious custom not only in Vienna, but other European cities, that immediately upon one's arrival at an hotel, or even a private home, the police are notified, unawares to the visitor, of his movements and his object in being in the city, which reduces chances of crime to a minimum, burglary being almost unknown, picking pockets on the open streets taking its place in most part. "Of course you know, children," said Herr Müller, as they passed along the broad Kärntnerstrasse, where are the finest shops of Vienna. "You have been taught in school the history of our city, so I need not tell you that." "Oh, but please do, father," said Ferdinand. "Teresa may not know it as well as I do." He hesitated, for he noticed the hurt look in the girl's eyes, and added, although she might know a lot more about other things. "Well," began the father, "away back in the times before Christ, a body of rough men came from the northern part of France and the surrounding countries. They were called Celts. They were constantly roving, and so it chanced they came to this very spot where we now are, and founded a village which they called Vindobona. But about 14 years after Christ, the Romans worked their way northward. They saw the village of the Celts and captured it. They built a great wall about it, placed a moat outside of these fortifications, and settled down to retain their conquest. They built a forum, which was a public square where all the business of the city was transacted, and on one side they placed their camp or praetorium. Today we call the Roman Forum the Hohermarkt, just here where we stand now," continued Herr Müller. "And here, where the Greek banker Sina has built his fine palace, stood the Roman praetorium, while here, you see, the street is named for Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor who was born in Spain and died in this city so many hundreds of years ago." "I've heard it ever so many times, father," said Ferdinand, "but I never realized it before. Somehow it seems as if I could almost see the Celts driven out and the great wall and moat of the Romans." Meanwhile they had walked on, down the Bauernmarkt, and reached the St. Stephaninplatz, with St. Stephan's Church in the middle. "There," said Herr Müller, pointing to the beautiful edifice, "is the oldest monument we have in Vienna, begun in 1144. Duke Heinrich Jasomirgott founded it." "Oh, he was our first duke," spoke up Teresa, who also wished to prove that she knew her Austrian history as well as her friend. "Yes, Teresa," answered Herr Müller, "but it's a long jump from the Romans to Duke Heinrich. Several hundred years after the expulsion of the Celts from Vindobona, Charlemagne, the undaunted conqueror of the age, absorbed it into the German Empire. He distinguished it from the rest of the German Empire by giving it the name of the Eastmark, or border of the Empire, Österreich, hence Austria. He placed the lord or margrave over it, and when Conrad III of Germany became emperor, he appointed Heinrich Jasomirgott ruler over the Eastmark, giving him at the same time the adjoining territory of Bavaria. But he had no right to dispose of these Bavarian lands as he chose, just because he was angry with the Bavarians, and when his son Frederick Redbeard Barbarossa came to the throne, he gave it back to the Bavarians. But Frederick Redbeard was a politic ruler. He did not wish to offend any of his subjects. In order to make up to Henry Jasomirgott for the loss of Bavaria, he raised him to the rank of duke, and thus Österreich, or the Eastmark, became a duchy. This was about 1100. Then, being such an important personage, Duke Heinrich determined to make his home in Vienna. He built himself a strong castle, surrounded it with a high stone wall and a moat, as was the custom at the time, and included within it the confines of the city, so that he and his people might not be molested by neighboring princes. "Here," continued Herr Müller, as they passed to the end of the Platz, "is the Graben. Today it is our most fashionable shopping district, but in the time of Duke Heinrich it was a moat filled with water, and here, where these rows of modern houses stand, were the ancient walls which protected the city." "Isn't it great?" cried Teresa, who, girl though she was, could appreciate the ancient struggles of her ancestors for liberty and defense. "Oh, father, there is the Stock Im Eisen," said Ferdinand. "Tell Teresa about that, please. She doesn't know." "Der Stock im Eisen?" repeated Teresa. "What is it?" "That old tree with the iron hoop around it, at the corner of the Graben," replied her companion. "We will reserve that tale for the evening," answered Herr Müller. "It is getting toward coffee hour, and we want to visit many places yet." As he spoke, they walked slowly along the Graben, which means moat in German, and, at the end of several minutes, they reached a large open square called Platz am Hof. "Here is what remains of the palace of the House of Babenberg, which Duke Heinrich built," said Herr Müller, "and here before it you see the Tiefe Graben, or deep moat, which amply protected the stronghold from attack, and there," he continued, moving as he spoke towards the building, "stands the Schottenhof." "The Schottenhof?" exclaimed Teresa, astonished. "Why is it called a Scottish palace in Austria?" "Because it was originally built and occupied by some monks from Scotland in the year 1158, whom Duke Heinrich had asked to come and instruct the citizens not only in religion, but in the educational arts, there being no schools in those days. All the teaching was done by the Holy Fathers, but later on the Scottish monks were dispossessed by a German order of monks, yet the Hof still bears the name of its founders, and even today the Church owns all this most valuable property right in the very heart of our city, which was given to them so many years ago." "That's the first time I thought about the Hof being Scottish," admitted Ferdinand, between whom and Teresa there was much rivalry and jealousy as to the amount of knowledge possessed by each. But the lad was generous enough to admit his ignorance, because he did not wish to assume too superior airs before his guest. "Here runs the tiny lane, the Schottengasse, which separates the Schottenhof from the smaller Mölkerhof, just across the land. and here are the ancient bastions which protected them. Today, you notice, these same names are retained. The bastions are no longer required, but history preserves their memory in preserving their names. The Schottenbastei and the Melkerbastei, now streets of the city of Vienna instead of bastions. But we have had quite enough of history, continued Herr Müller. I am quite certain our little convent friend is tired. Oh, no, indeed, spoke up Teresa. At the convent we take long walks every day, and in the country at Linz we do much walking too. It does not tire me at all. But walking about city streets is quite different from country lanes, my girl, observed Herr Müller. Yes, but we do not have the interesting places to visit, nor the tales to hear in the lanes, wisely answered the child. Well then, if you are quite certain you are not too tired, we will walk home. We will go by the way of the Ring, here behind the Schottenhof, and we will walk over the old walls, which were erected in later years as the original city of Duke Heinrich grew. Of course, we have no use for these fortifications in these days, so we have changed them into a magnificent boulevard. No one, not knowing the original use of the Ring, would ever have suspected the mission it had fulfilled. So broad and handsome was the avenue encircling what is called the Innere Stadt, inner city, planted with magnificent trees and bubbling over with life, color, and gaiety. Teresa would like to have stopped at every fine building and park, but Herr Müller promised to ask her brother to allow her a few days with them in Vienna before returning to the convent in the fall, that she might see all there was not time now to show her. For the present must suffice a cursory glance of the Burghof or imperial residence, the royal theatre, the Hofgarten, and the Volksgarten, gay with the scarlet skirts and gold cloth caps of hundreds of nursemaids watching over the youthful cares. "Wouldn't it be splendid to be an emperor?" remarked Teresa to her companion, "and live in such a fine palace?" "Oh, that isn't much of a palace," remarked Ferdinand, somewhat contemptuously. "That's just like a prison to me. You ought to see Schönbrunn, the summer home of the emperor." "Oh, I have been to Schönbrunn," returned the girl, with disdain in her voice. "The sisters took us all there once. They showed us the room where the Duke of Reichstadt died and where his father, Napoleon, lived when he took Vienna." "Well, I'll bet you haven't seen the celebration on Maundy Thursday, when the emperor sends his 24 gorgeous gala coaches with the magnificent horses and mounted escorts in uniform to bring the 24 poor men and women to his palace, that he might humble himself to wash their feet?" "No, I haven't seen that," admitted Teresa. "Tell me about it. Have you seen it?" "I have heard father tell about it a number of times," continued the lad. "The emperor sends his wonderful holiday coaches, with the escorts in gorgeous uniforms. They bring the poor men and women to the palace, and set a splendid banquet for them. Then they go to the royal chapel and hear mass, at which the emperor and the royal family and the entire court are present. After that, the poor folks are led to the banquet hall, and here they are served from silver platters, which the emperor and his royal family present to them. After that, the emperor kneels before them and wipes their feet with a wet cloth." "He does that himself?" asked Teresa, who had listened spellbound that her beloved emperor should conduct such a ceremony. "Indeed he does, and furthermore," added the boy, with ineffable pride, "he is the only monarch, so father tells me, who preserves the ancient custom. But that isn't all. The emperor sends these astonished poor people home again in the gorgeous coaches. He gives them each a purse in which is about $15. He sends a great basket filled with the remains of the banquet, which they have left untouched, together with a bottle of wine and a fine bouquet of flowers. And what do you think, Teresa?" "I'm sure I couldn't guess," admitted the child. "He gives them the silver platters from which he served them." "What a splendid emperor!" cried Teresa. Then she added, "I've seen the emperor." "Oh, that's nothing," most ungallantly replied the boy. "Franz Joseph walks about our streets like Harun al-Rashid used to in the Arabian Nights. Anyone can see the emperor. He allows even the poorest to come and see him in his palace every week, and he talks to them just as if he was a plain, ordinary man, and not an emperor at all." "Well, I have had him speak to me," answered Teresa. "At the convent he praised my work." There was a dead silence. Herr Müller walked along, not a muscle in his face betraying the fact that he had overheard this juvenile conversation, for fear of interrupting a most entertaining dialogue. "Has he ever spoken directly to you?" demanded the girl, seeing that Ferdinand did not reply. "No." Again a dead silence. "The emperor needs our love and sympathy," said Herr Müller, after waiting in vain for the children to renew their talk. "His beloved Empress Elisabeth has been taken from him by an assassin's hand. His favorite brother, Maximilian, went to his doom in the city of Mexico, the victim of the ambition of a Napoleon. Even his heir, the Crown Prince, is dead, and when our beloved king shall be no more, the very name of Habsburg will have passed away." "He is a very kind man," replied Teresa. "He comes often to the convent, and he makes us feel that he is not an emperor, but one of us." Herr Müller touched his head in respect. "Long live our beloved emperor, our most sympathetic friend," he said. By this time they had gained the entrance of their home. Joseph opened the public door to admit them to the corridor, and they ascended to the 3rd floor, to the apartment of Herr Müller. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer. Chapter 2 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Der Stock im Eisen. That evening, after a hearty dinner, the children called for the story of Der Stock im Eisen, and so Herr Müller began. Many hundreds of years ago, in the old square known as the Horse Market, lived Vienna's most skilful master locksmith, Herr Erhard Marbacher. Next door to him stood a baker's shop, owned by the widow Mux. The widow and Herr Marbacher were good neighbors, and were fond of chatting together outside the doors of their homes as the evening came on. Herr Marbacher smoking his long, quaintly painted pipe, and the widow Mux relating the sprightly anecdotes of the day. But one evening Herr Marbacher found the widow in great distress. As she usually wore a merry smile upon her jolly face, this change in temperament greatly affected the spirits of the locksmith, and he demanded the cause of her unhappiness. With tears in her eyes, the widow confided to her neighbor the dreadful fact that her younger son Martin, a worthless, idle fellow, had refused to do any work about the shop, and had even used harsh words. "Sometimes it happens," suggested the master locksmith, "that the lad does not take to his forced employment. It may be that Martin is not cut out for a baker. Let me have a hand with him. Perhaps he will make a first-rate locksmith." "A locksmith!" exclaimed the widow in astonishment. "How can he become a locksmith? with its attendant hard work, when he will not even run errands for the baker shop? No, Herr Marbacher, you are very kind to suggest it, and try to help me out of my trouble, but Martin would never consent to become a locksmith's apprentice. He is downright lazy. Well, you might let me have a trial with him, said the locksmith. I am loved by all my workmen, yet they fear me too. They do good work under my direction, and I am proud of my apprentices. Martin, I am certain, would also obey me. Well, have your way, good neighbor, replied the widow. I can only hope for the best. Evidently, Herr Marbacher knew human nature better than the widow, for Martin was delighted with the prospect of becoming an apprentice locksmith, with the hope of earning the degree of master locksmith, like Herr Marbacher, and he worked hard and long to please his master. His mother was overjoyed at the change in the lad, and Herr Marbacher himself was very well pleased. Now it chanced that, some little time after Martin's apprenticeship, Herr Marbacher handed him a tin pail and directed him to a certain spot on the edge of the forest, without the city walls, where he should gather clay with which to mould a certain form, for which he had had an order. As the commission was a particular one, and somewhat out of the ordinary, it required a peculiar sort of clay, which was only to be found in this particular spot. With light heart, and whistling a merry tune, Martin, swinging his tin pail, set out upon his errand. The day was perfect. Spring was just beginning. The trees were clothed in their fresh greenness, light clouds flitted across a marvelous blue sky, the birds twittered noisily in the tree-tops, and Martin caught the spring fever. He fairly bounded over the green fields, and reached the forest in a wonderfully short time. Having filled his pail, he started homewards, but instead of keeping to the path by which he had come, he crossed through the meadows, his heart as light as ever. Suddenly he espied through the trees figures of men or boys. Then voices came to his ears. He stopped and listened. Boylike, he was unable to resist the temptation, the lure of the spring. So he changed his course and made towards the boulders, his old-time cronies, who were engaged in their old-time sport. Slower moved his feet. His conscience prompted him in vain. He forgot the admonition of his master not to loiter on the way, for fear the city gates would be shut at the ringing of the curfew. He forgot all about the time of day, and that it was now well on toward evening. The fever of the spring had gotten into his veins. Martin paused, set down his bucket of clay, and, picking up a bowl, joined in the sport of his comrades. Suddenly the curfew bell reached his ears. He recalled his errand, the warning of his master, and his heart stopped still in fright. He dropped the bowl in his hands, grasped his bucket of clay, and ran with beating heart toward the city gate. But he was too late. The gate was closed, and the gatekeeper either would not or could not hear his call. Fear now seized Martin in very truth. The woods about the city were infested with robbers and dangerous men. There was no way in which to protect himself, yet he had nothing about him which anyone would care to have, and that thought gave him some comfort. As he was planning how he might get within the walls, a tall man dressed in scarlet feather cap and a long black velvet cloak upon his shoulders stood before him. "Cheer up, my lad," said the stranger. "What is the use of crying?" "But I am locked out for the night," replied Martin. "That is nothing to fret about," answered the tall man. "Here is some gold. Take it. It will open the gate for you." "Oh, thank you," said Martin, overjoyed. Then he hesitated. "But I shall never be able to repay you," he added. "I have never seen so much gold." "Oh, do not fret yourself about repaying me," answered the stranger. "I have plenty of gold, and do not need the little I have given you. Still, if you are really anxious to repay me, you might give me your soul when you have finished with it." "My soul?" cried the boy aghast. "I can't give it to you. One cannot sell his soul?" "Oh, yes," replied the malicious stranger, smiling grimly. "Many people do sell their souls. But you did not give it me until you were dead." "Much good would it do you then," replied Martin. "I cannot see what you would want with it after I am dead." "That is the bargain," retorted the tall man, and he made as if to move away and leave Martin to his fate. "Oh, very well," said Martin, fearing to throw away this chance of deliverance. "I will take your gold, and you may have my soul when I have finished with it. The bargain is made." "And I shall be lenient with you," continued the stranger. "I will give you a chance to redeem your soul." "You will?" exclaimed Martin in delight. "And how?" "Only this. If you forget to attend divine service even once during all the rest of your days, then shall I claim my bargain. Now, am I not fair?" Martin was very glad to be released, even with this proviso, and laughed as he moved away, for Martin had been brought up religiously by a pious mother, and he knew he should not forget his Sabbath duty. As the stranger had said, the Gold Gate entrance for Martin Mux through the closed city gate, and he straightway made his way to his room and to bed before his master should discover his absence. Some days later, as the apprentices were hard at work in the shop under the scrutinizing eye of Herr Marbacher, a tall man in a black velvet coat and a red plumed cape stood in the doorway. Martin recognized his erstwhile friend and feared he knew not what. But the stranger had come to order an iron hoop with padlock so intricate that it could not be unlocked. Herr Marbacher hesitated. The order was certainly unusual, and even he, the master locksmith of Vienna, was uncertain whether he could accomplish such a commission. But, seeing Marbacher's hesitation, the stranger cast his glance about the shop full of young apprentices, and, fixing his regard upon Martin, he said in a loud voice, "Among all these workmen, is there not one who can make the lock?" Whether impelled by fear, or feeling that having assisted him once, the devil would assist him yet a second time, Martin spoke out, "I will do it." All eyes turned toward the young apprentice. "You?" cried Marbacher, and he laughed very loud and very long, so excellent did he consider the joke. "You? You are my very youngest apprentice." "Let him try," suggested the stranger warily, fearing the master would deny Martin the privilege. "Who knows what he may be able to accomplish?" And so it was agreed. Martin worked all that day until the evening shadows compelled him to quit his work. He racked his brain. He thought and thought, yet no lock could he imagine which could not be unlocked. He carried his paper and pencil to his room with him, thinking that in the stillness of the night he might think of some design. But although he worked conscientiously, no ideas came to him, and he fell asleep. With visions of locks and bolts and bars in his head, it was no wonder that Martin dreamed of robbers' castles and dungeons and locks and bolts. He dreamed about a mighty robber in a fortress castle. He was a prisoner there. He, Martin. But what his crime he did not know. He rushed toward the door to make his escape. It was locked. He tried to undo it, but in vain. Then he looked about him, and the room seemed filled with padlocks, some small, some large, some handsomely wrought, some very simple, but among them he found one that looked like a huge spider. It interested him so much that he took out his pencil and mechanically reproduced it. Then he felt himself sinking, down, down. With a start he awoke. He had tossed himself out of bed and lay sprawling upon the floor of his room. Rather piqued, Martin picked himself up and jumped into bed. But there, upon his pillow, lay a drawing. He examined it by the feeble rays of the candle, which was still burning. It was the design of the spider-lock he had seen in the robber's castle in his dream. Impatient for the morning, Martin was at his bench early, working upon the design of the lock, and when the end of the 6th day arrived, the time appointed by the stranger for the delivery of the work, Martin had the lock completed. Evidently it proved entirely satisfactory to the stranger, for he paid Marbacher the money agreed upon, and left the shop. At the corner of the square he stopped before the large tree, bound the iron hoop about the tree, locked it, put the key in his pocket, and disappeared. Time passed. Martin, for some inexplicable reason, had left Vienna and gone to the city of Nuremberg, where he continued in his profession. But one day he heard that the Burgomaster of Vienna had offered the title of Master Locksmith to the one who would make a key which would unlock the iron hoop about the large tree. It was a small task for Martin to make the duplicate of the key he had once made, and with it in his pocket he travelled to Vienna and presented it to the Burgomaster. It was a great holiday when the hoop was to be unbound. Dressed in robes of state, glistening all over with gold thread and medals, the Burgomaster and the city fathers gathered in the horse market, where stood the Stock Im Eisen. The lock was unfastened, and Martin was created a master locksmith, much to the joy of his mother and to the overwhelming pride of his former master, Herr Marbacher. But although Martin Mux had now acquired fortune and fame, he was far from being happy. His bargain with the devil haunted him, day and night it was with him, for he feared Sunday morning might come and he would forget to attend mass. And then he would be irretrievably lost. What would he not give to be able to recall his bargain? He enjoyed no peace of mind. At his bench he thought ever of the dreaded day when he must pay. He could no longer work. He must not think. He joined his old-time idle companions. Hour after hour was spent in gambling. Night after night he frittered his wealth away. The more he lost, the more desperate he became. Poor Martin Mux was paying dearly for his game of bowls and his disobedience to his master. One Saturday evening Martin joined his comrades quite early, but luck had deserted him. He lost and lost. One by one the other habitués of the place had gone until there was no one left but Martin and his few friends at table with him. He paid no heed to time. All he thought of was to regain some of his lost money. Suddenly, as had happened some years before, out on the bowling green, Martin heard the deep tones of a bell. But this was not the curfew. It was the church bell calling to mass. Martin looked up from his cards and saw the sun shining brightly through the curtained windows. His heart stood still with fright, for his bargain flashed through his mind. He threw down the cards and fled into the street like a madman. On and on he ran. He brushed past the tall man, but heeding him not, Martin rushed on. "Hurry, my friend!" called out the stranger, whom he had jostled. "Hurry! The church bell has rung. The bargain is paid." A malicious laugh rang in Martin's ear. He turned and saw the evil-eyed stranger, him of the black velvet coat and red plumed cape. Mad with fear, Martin bounded up the church steps. He entered the house of worship, but the stranger had said truly, it was too late. The bargain was due, for the service was ending. Martin Mux turned to leave the church, but at the threshold he fell dead. The stranger had claimed his soul. Since that time it has been the custom for every locksmith apprentice, whether he comes into Vienna to seek his fortunes, or whether he goes out from Vienna to other parts, to drive a nail into the stump of the large tree, and offer up a prayer for the peace of Martin Mux's soul. That is why the old tree is so studded with nails. "What a dreadful bargain for Martin to make!" said Teresa fearfully. "How could he have given his soul away?" "He chose the easier way out of the small difficulty, and he paid dearly for it," replied Herr Müller. "It is not always the easiest way which is the wisest, after all." End of chapter 2. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 3 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The farm in Upper Austria. The following morning, the Müller family and Teresa Runkel boarded the boat in the canal, which should take them up current to Linz. It was most exciting for Ferdinand, who had never been on the Danube before, but to Teresa it was quite usual, for she always made the journey to and from her home by way of the river. There was a great deal of excitement upon the quay. The fish-boats had come in with their supply for the day, and fishermen were shouting themselves hoarse in their endeavours to overshout their competitors. The children seated themselves in the bow of the boat, that they might miss nothing of the scenery which is so delightful near Vienna, with its green banks, its thick forests, and its distant mountains. "Do you know what the grim castle is over there on the left?" asked Herr Müller. "Oh, yes," replied Teresa quickly. "That is the castle of Griefenstein." "Then you know its history?" asked Herr Müller. "Yes, indeed," answered the child. "Sometimes the sister who takes me home tells me, and sometimes father. But doesn't Ferdinand know it?" "No," answered the boy. "I haven't been on the river before," as if it required some explanation for his seeming ignorance. "Then tell it to him, please," said Teresa, "for it is a splendid tale. Long ages ago, this castle belonged to a lord who was, like all noblemen of that time, very fond of adventure. Whenever the least opportunity offered to follow his king, he would take up his sword and his shield and his coat of mail, and hie him off to the wars. Now, the lord of the castle had a young and beautiful wife, whose wonderful golden locks were a never-ending delight to him. Having a great deal of time upon her hands, and neighbors being few and far between, the lady of the castle passed her time in arranging her magnificent hair in all sorts of fashions, some very simple, while others were most intricate and effective. It chanced that one day, after an absence of several months, the lord of the castle returned. Hastening to his wife's boudoir, he found her before her mirror, dressing her hair in most bewitching fashion. After greeting her, he remarked about her elaborate head-dress, and laughingly the young wife asked her husband how he liked it. "It is much too handsome," he replied, "for a young woman whose husband is away to the wars. It is not well for a woman to be so handsome." And without further word, he seized the sword which hung at his side, removed it from its scabbard, and with one stroke cut off the beautiful locks of his young wife. But no sooner had he done so than he was angry with himself for his display of temper. He rushed from the room to cool his anger, when whom did he run into in the corridor but the castle chaplain. The poor young lord was so ashamed of himself for his ungovernable temper that, with even less reason than before, he seized the frightened and astonished chaplain by the two shoulders, dragged him down the castle steps, and threw him into the dungeon. "Now," said he, after bolting the door securely, "pray, my good man, that the day may be hastened when the balustrade of my castle steps may become so worn by the hands of visitors that it may hold the hair of my wife, which I have cut off in my folly." There is nothing so unreasonable as a man in anger. I presume, had the cook of the castle chanced to come in the way of my lord's anger, he too would have been thrown into the dungeon, and all would have starved, just to appease the temper of the impossible lord. Fortunately, the cook, or the hostler, or any of the knights or attendants of the castle did not appear, and thus was averted a great calamity. When the lord had had time to calm down a bit, he realized how unjust had been his actions. It was impossible to restore his wife's hair, but at least he might release the chaplain. A castle without a priest is indeed a sorry place. In his haste to descend the steps to the dungeon, the lord caught his foot. Perhaps his own sword, which had been the means of his folly, tripped him. In any event, he fell down the entire flight and was picked up quite dead. "It served him quite right," interrupted Ferdinand. "Oh, but that wasn't the end of the lord, by any means," continued Herr Müller, smiling. "He is doomed to wander about his castle until the balustrade has been worn so deep that it will hold 2 hands of hair like those he cut from his wife. The penitent lord has roamed about the castle for many a year, crying out to all who pass, 'Greif den Stein! Greif den Stein!' Grasp the stone!" Long ago he realized how foolish had been his actions, but although he has heartily repented, yet may he never know the rest of his grave until the balustrade has been worn hollow." "And does he yet wander there?" asked Ferdinand. "So they say, but one cannot see him except at night. There are many who claim to have heard him calling out, 'Greif den Stein!' But although I have been up and down the river many times, sometimes in the daytime and sometimes at night, I, myself, have never heard the ghostly voice." "I have always felt sorrier for the poor lad without her beautiful golden hair," observed Teresa, after a moment's silence, "and I always felt glad to think the lord had to be punished for his wickedness. But somehow, hearing you tell the story, Herr Müller, I wish his punishment might not last much longer. For he was truly sorry, wasn't he?" Herr Müller looked quizzically at his wife, and they both turned their heads from the earnest faces of the children. "Do you find the old legends of the Danube interesting, Teresa?" asked Herr Müller, as the boat sped along, and the children maintained silence. "Oh, I love all sorts of tales," the child replied. "Father tells us some occasionally, but I am home so little of the time now, I do not hear as many as I used to. In the summer days we are always so busy at the farm, we do not have the time for story-telling as we do in the winter days." Austria is full of tales about lords and ladies, ghosts and towers, but the Danube legends are not as well known as those of the Rhine. Have you ever heard that story concerning the Knight of Frauenneck, near Baden?" "No, Herr Müller," replied Theresa. "Well, it isn't much of a tale when you compare it with the Habsburg legends and the Greifenstein, and Stock Im Eisen, but then it is worth telling." "Begin," commanded the young son, in playful mood. "Well, near Baden there stands a formidable fortress called Frauenneck, where lived a knight in former years. As he was about to go to war, and might return after many years, and perhaps never, he decided to hide the treasures of the castle and place a spell upon them, so that none might touch them but those for whom they were intended. So, in secrecy, he mounted to the summit of the great tower of the castle, and on the battlement he planted a cherry stone, saying as he did so, 'From this stone shall spring forth a tree, a mighty cherry tree. From the trunk of the tree shall be fashioned a cradle, and in that cradle shall be rocked a young baby, who, in later years, shall become a priest. To this priest shall my treasure belong. But even he may not be able to find the treasure until another cherry tree shall have grown upon the tower, from a stone dropped by a bird of passage. When all these conditions have been complied with, then shall the priest find the treasure at the foot of my tree, and not until then.' Then the careful knight, fearing for the safety of his treasure, even after such precautions, called upon a ghost to come and watch over the castle tower, that peradventure daring robbers, who might presume to thrust inside the spells which bound the treasure, would fear to cope with a ghost." "And did the priest ever come?" queried Theresa. "Not yet, child. The cherry tree at the top of the tower is but yet a sapling. There are long years yet to wait." "But we do not believe in ghosts, father," interrupted Ferdinand. "Why could not some one go and dig at the root of the tree and see if the treasure were really there?" "One could, if he chose, no doubt," answered Herr Müller, "but no one has." "Would you, Ferdinand?" asked Theresa. "Oh, I might, if I were a grown man and had a lot of soldiers with me." "Do you know another legend, Herr Müller?" asked Theresa shortly. "Well, there is the legend of Endersdorf in Moravia. A shepherd once lived in the neighborhood, and although he had always been exceedingly poor, often almost to the verge of starvation, yet one morning his neighbors found that he had suddenly become exceedingly rich. Everyone made conjectures concerning the source of his wealth, but none of them became the confidant of the shepherd, so that none were ever the wiser. The erstwhile poor shepherd left his humble cot and built himself a magnificent estate and palace upon the spot. He surrounded himself with retainers and sportsmen, and gave himself up quite naturally to a life of ease and indolence. Most of his time was spent in following the hounds, but with all his newly acquired wealth, and notwithstanding the memory of days when a few pence meant a fortune to him, the shepherd lost all sense of pity, and none about the countryside were quite so penurious and selfish as he. To such poor wayfarers as accosted him, in mercy's name to befriend them, he turned a deaf ear, until his name was the synonym for all that was miserable and hard-hearted. Now it happened that one day a poor beggar came to the gate of the rich shepherd, asking for alms. The shepherd was about to leave the gate in company with a noisy crowd of hunters and followers, on his way to the chase. Taking no pity on the poor man's condition, he suddenly conceived the idea of making the beggar his prey. "He is sport for us, good man," he cried. "Let us drive the beggar before us with our whips, and see him scamper lively." Whereupon, following the action of their host, the entire company raised their whips, set spurs to the horses, and drove the trembling, frightened, outraged men from before them. "Now has your hour come," cried out the old man, as he turned and defied his assailants. "May all the curses of heaven fall upon your heads, ye hard-hearted lot of roisterers!" At the word, the sky, which had before been cloudless, grew suddenly black. The lightning flashed, the thunder rolled. The very ground under their feet shook, cracked, and opened, swallowing the shepherd, his followers, their horses, dogs, and every vestige of his estate vanished. In its place arose a lake whose dark waters tossed and moaned in strange fashion. On stormy days, even to this present day, when the waters of the lake are lashing themselves in fury, the shepherd of the hard heart can be seen passing across the waves, his whip raised to strike some unseen object, a black hunting dog behind him. How long his punishment may last, no one knows, but he can always be seen, just as he was when the earthquake swallowed him up. "Isn't it strange?" observed Teresa. "But every one of the tales end in the punishment of the wicked knight." "Of course," remarked Ferdinand. "They wouldn't be tales at all if the wrongdoer was allowed to go free. Wouldn't they, father?" "Indeed not. But now it's time for breakfast. Would you like to eat on deck? It is so perfect a day, it is a pity to go indoors." This suggestion appealed wonderfully to the children, and Herr Müller left them to order the meal served upon the deck. As night fell, the boat docked at Linz. Herr Runkel was waiting on the quay with a heavy wagon and a team of horses to drive them to the farm. It was a beautiful drive in the bright moonlight, and the lights of Linz twinkled below them, while the Danube sparkled in the distance, just like a fairy world. It was very late when they reached the farmhouse. Frau Runkel greeted them cordially, and immediately after helping them off with their wraps, poured out steaming hot coffee to warm them up, the night air having been a trifle chilly. Ferdinand went directly to his room after coffee was served. It was on the opposite side of the house, on the ground floor. The farmhouse was but 1 story high, with a lofty attic above. In one corner of the large bedroom stood a canopied bed of dark wood, elaborately painted in bright colors, on head and footboard, with designs of flowers and birds. There were 2 small, stiff-backed wooden chairs, a night table upon which stood a brass candlestick, and an enormous wardrobe or chest for his clothes. All the furnishings of the room, even to the rug by the bed, were the handiwork of the occupants of the farmhouse, for no true Austrian peasant would condescend to purchase these household necessities from a shop. Between 2 voluminous feather beds Ferdinand slept soundly, nor did he stir until he heard voices in the garden. Hastily dressing, he made his way into the living room, where breakfast had already been partaken of by the others. "I'm so sorry to be late," he apologized shamefacedly. "Why didn't you call me, Mother?" he asked, as he turned to the one who must naturally share the responsibility of her children's shortcomings. "We thought to let you have your rest," answered Frau Müller. "Your day will be very full. You evidently enjoyed your downy bed." "Oh, it was great. Let us get one, Mother." "I used to sleep under one when I was a girl," replied Frau Müller, "but no one in the city uses them any more. The woolly blankets have quite superseded them." "You may take yours home with you, if you like," said Frau Runkel. "We have geese enough to make more." "Now," said Herr Runkel, "if you are all ready, we'll go over and pay our respects to Father and Mother." "Then your parents do not live with you?" asked Herr Müller, a little astonished. "No, that is not the custom among us. You see, when I got married, Father made over the farm and all its appurtenances to me, being the eldest son. Then he built himself another home, just over in the field there," and Herr Runkel pointed to a tiny, cosy cottage some few hundred paces away. "What a splendid thing to be the eldest son," remarked Herr Müller. "Perhaps it is," replied his host, "but it entails a great responsibility as well. You see, after the ceremony of deeding the farm away to me, I am called upon to settle an allowance upon my parents during their lifetime." "That's but right," assented Herr Müller, "seeing that they have given you everything they possess, and which they have acquired with such toil and privation." "Yes, but father received the farm from his father in just the same manner, although he has enlarged it so that it is bigger and better. But in addition to father and mother," continued the farmer, "I have all my brothers and sisters to look after. There is Teresa at the convent in Vienna, there is Frederick at the gymnasium in Linz, and there is Max, an apprentice, in Zara. These must all be cared for, and I can tell you, Müller, it's a responsible position, that of being the eldest son." "But you weren't called upon, Franz," replied his friend, "to provide so bountifully for each." "No, but what would you have?" he replied. "I have tried to be a dutiful son, and," he added, his eyes twinkling as he glanced at his wife, "I've been sort of lenient towards father and the children, because father let me off so lightly when he boxed my ears for the last time." "Boxed your ears?" exclaimed Herr Müller in astonishment. "What had you done to deserve such disgrace?" "Well, that was part of the ceremony. When the farm was made over to me, it's the custom, before signing the deed, for the owner to make the rounds of his estate with his family. When he comes to each of the 4 corner posts, he boxes the ears of the new owner. Now, father might have boxed mine roundly had he chosen, for I was somewhat of a rollicker in my youth," and the genial farmer chuckled softly, "but father was sparing of my feelings. Don't you believe he deserved a recompense?" "He certainly did," answered his friend, and they all laughed heartily over the matter. Meanwhile they had gained the entrance of the Dower House, as the home of the aged couple was called. As Herr Müller had not seen the parents of his friend since childhood, there were many years of acquaintanceship to bridge over, and Ferdinand, fascinated, listened to the conversation, for this old couple were most interesting persons to talk with. After returning from church, the family gathered on the wide veranda under the eaves, the women with their knitting, which is not considered improper even on Sundays among Austrian women. This veranda in the peasant home in Upper Austria is a most important part of the house. It is protected from the elements by the enormous overhanging eaves above, running the entire side of the house. Heavy timbers support it, green with growing vines which climb from the porch boxes filled with gaily blossoming flowers. It is a tiny garden brought to one's sitting room. The birds twitter in the sunlight as they fly in and out of their nests under the eaves, and here the neighbors gossip and drink coffee and munch delicious cakes. In fact, it is the sole sitting room of the family during warm days, for no peasant woman would think of shutting herself in a room to do her work. One can always work to better advantage in the sunlight and open air. The children rambled about the farm and outbuildings. The farmhouse was very long and deep and low, with a long slanting roof. The front door was of heavy timbers, upon which was a design of St. Martin outlined in nails, the work of the farmer, while small crosses at either side of the door were considered sufficient protection from the evil spirits who might wish to attack the family within. The interior of the farmhouse was very simple. A large vestibule, called the Laube or Bower, served as a means of communication between the different parts of the house. The sleeping rooms were ranged on one side, while the dining and living room occupied the other, with the kitchen just beyond. The Gesindestube, or living room, was very plain, with its bare floors and darkened walls, a tile stove in one corner, benches about the walls and chests, some plain, some elaborately decorated and carved, occupied whatever space was left. Here were kept the household linens and the wardrobes for the family, as no Austrian peasant home is built with closets, as we have in America. That evening Herr Runkel said to Ferdinand, "To-morrow, my boy, we work. Would you like to help?" "Oh, it would be jolly," replied the lad. After a moment's hesitation he added, "What kind of work? Hoeing potatoes or weeding the garden?" These two tasks were the only ones the lad was familiar with upon his uncle's farm in Tyrol. The farmer laughed. "No, we won't do that," he said. "We will leave that to the servants. But we will make shoes." "Make shoes?" exclaimed the child incredulously. "Really make them yourself? I've never made shoes," he added, doubting whether he might be allowed now to assist. "Why not?" answered Herr Runkel. "You know we are very old-fashioned here, and as we have so far to go to the shops, why we don't go. We let the workmen come to us. This is an off time of the season, so we have the tailors and the shoemakers and all sorts of folk come and help us with such things as we can't do ourselves, for, you know, we make everything we use on the farm and everything we wear." "Oh, how fine!" said Ferdinand. "Yes, and we have jolly times too," continued the farmer, "for when work is over we play. Isn't that right?" Ferdinand went to bed that night with visions of tailors and shoemakers and harness-makers and what not in his head, until he fell asleep. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer. Chapter 4 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Peasant's Dance. Ferdinand needed no call to arouse him in the morning. He was awake and up long before any of his family, but he did not catch Herr Runkel nor his buxom wife napping. "Come along, Ferdinand, and help me get the leather ready for the man," said the farmer, and he led the way across the garden to a great timber building 2 stories in height. He opened the door, and they entered a very large room with a decided smoky smell about it. "What is this?" asked Ferdinand. "This is our Feldkasten (field box), where we keep all our supplies. Here are the seeds for planting when the time comes. Here are the hams and bacons and dried meat for use during the winter. Here is the lard for the year." And Herr Runkel took off the lids of the great casks and showed the white lard to the child, astonished beyond expression at this collection of supplies. "And what's in the loft?" asked the boy, seeing the substantial ladder leading thereto. "Oh, that's for the women folks," he replied. "We keep all sorts of things there. Let's go up." And they ascended. The loft was a room full of shelves. In most delightful order were ranged bundles of white cotton cloth, bundles of flax for spinning, bundles of woolen goods for making up into apparel, some dyed and some in natural wool. There were rows and rows of yarn for embroidering the garments of the peasants, and upon the floor in one corner was a great heap of leather, with all sorts of machinery and harness. And Ferdinand never could learn what there was not here, so overwhelmed was he. "Here we are," said Herr Runkel, as they tugged at the pile of leather. "We must get this out, for the shoemakers start after breakfast. Give us a lift, child." And he half dragged, half lifted the lever to the trap-door and let it slide down the ladder. For days afterwards Ferdinand was in a fever of excitement. First he would help get out the leather for the heavy farm shoes, working the best he could with his inexperience, the main thing being to keep busy, and he certainly accomplished it. Then he helped the tailors, for everyone who could be spared about the farm joined in the tasks of the journeymen, that they might finish their work and move on to another farm before the busy season should begin for the farmers. It is customary in addition to the low wages of about 12 cents a day for servants to receive their clothing as part payment, so that upon a large farm of the extent of Herr Runkel's there were many to be provided for. Frau Müller assisted Frau Runkel in the kitchen, where Teresa too was kept busy, even Ferdinand not disdaining to make himself useful in that department. At length the journeymen were finished, and Herr Müller spoke about leaving in a few days for Tyrol. "We shall have a merry-making then before you go," said his host. "But I presume parties are not novelty to you, are they, Ferdinand? City folks, especially Viennese, are very gay." "Oh, we never have parties in Vienna," replied the lad. "That is, private parties. They cost too much. But we have our masked balls and ice festivals. Of course I can't go to those. They are only for grown folks." Herr Müller took up the thread of conversation at this point. "Vienna, with all its glitter, is but a poor city after all," he said. "Living is very costly. The rich and the aristocracy have impoverished themselves by their extravagant ways of living. They dwell in fine homes, wear gorgeous uniforms and gowns, but cannot pay for these extravagances. They have shooting lodges in the mountains, country villas for the summer, besides the town homes, but they have the fear constantly over their heads that these will be taken from them to redeem the mortgages upon them." "I am more than ever thankful," replied the farmer, "that I have my farm and my family, and owe no man." "You are certainly right," answered his friend. "It is to such men as you that Austria must look in the future." "But about the party, Herr Runkel," interrupted Ferdinand, who feared that his host might forget his suggestion. "Oh, yes. Well, we'll have that Saturday night. So run along and help the women folks get ready for it, for you never saw such feasts as we do have at our parties, child." Ferdinand, being just a boy, rushed off to the kitchen to provide for the spread that was to come, and he and Teresa chattered like two magpies over the splendid prospect. Although Ferdinand Müller did not quite believe that Saturday afternoon would ever come, it eventually did come, and a perfect day too. Teresa was dressed in her most shining silver buckles and her whitest of homespun stockings, while Frau Runkel outshone everyone in the room with her gaily embroidered apron over her dark skirt and her overwhelming display of handmade silver ornaments in her ears, upon her arms, about her neck, and on her fingers. And her headdress was a marvel to behold, glistening with gold thread and shining with tiny beads of various colors. The table was set in the Gesindestube. There were roast ducks and geese and chickens, roast meats and stewed meats, and Wiener Schnitzel, veal cutlet, without which no Austrian home is complete. There were sausage and cheese, and black bread and noodles. There were cakes with white frosting and pink frosting, and some were decorated with tiny colored seeds like caraway seeds. Never had Ferdinand beheld such a sight before, but truly the Austrian peasant knows how to enjoy life. The reception over, the host and hostess led the way to the dining table, the men placing themselves on a bench on one side, while the women sat opposite them on the other. With bowed heads the host said the grace. Then began the gaiety. There was no constraint. Each helped himself and his neighbor bountifully. Meanwhile the two young children at the foot of the board were not neglected, but kept up a lively conversation of their own, utterly oblivious of their elders. "Wait until the dessert comes," said Teresa. "Did you ever see one of these nettle cakes?" "Nettle cakes?" repeated the lad. "What is that?" "Oh, you will see," replied the young lady, looking wise. "But be careful, I warn you, not to prick your fingers. Perhaps, though," she added, "Mother may not allow us to join in, for this is a special feast day in honor of you and your parents." Ferdinand was not kept long in suspense. The viands having been disposed of to the satisfaction of everyone, the maid brought in the piece de resistance. It towered high above her head, and had she not been brought up in the open air of the country, she certainly never would have had the strength to manage such a burden. Upon a huge wooden dish was piled high fresh fruits from the orchard, cakes with delicious frosting, nuts, and bright flowers. It was a medley of colour, set off by great streamers of gay ribbons and boughs, quite like a bridal cake, but vastly more interesting. Tongues wagged fast, you may be sure. All wished to get a chance at the gorgeous centrepiece. Nevertheless, they all waited for their host's approval, and, waiting his opportunity, when many were not on the alert, he raised his hand, and then such a scramble you never saw in all your days. The men rose out of their seats and grabbed for one particular sweetmeat, which might appeal to the palate of his fair partner. But for all their precautions, knowing the hidden secrets of the dessert, many emerged from the battle with scratched hands or bleeding fingers, for these delicious cakes and luscious fruits covered prickly nettles, a trap for the unskilful. But what mattered these trifles to the happy-hearted peasant folk? They chatted and laughed, and dived for fruit, and decked the hair of their favourites with gay flowers, or cracked nuts with their knife handles, and fed them to their lady loves. With the coffee the feast ended. Carrying the benches to the sides of the room where they ordinarily reposed, the table was cleared as if by magic. Now the dance was on. Zithers and violins appeared, and the darkened rafters of the Gesindestube rang with the clatter of many feet. By 10 o'clock all was quiet at the farmhouse. The guests had complimented their host and hostess upon the success of the evening, and the elaborateness of the table. They bade farewell to the Müller family, and, saying good night to all, made their way over the fields, singing with hearty voices their tuneful folk songs, and thus Ferdinand heard the last of them ere he fell asleep. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer. Chapter 5 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Some Tyrolese Legends. The following morning, Herr und Frau Müller and Ferdinand bade their kind host and hostess good-bye, and they set out for Linz, where they would take the train to Innsbruck, the capital of Upper Tyrol. Ferdinand was very loath to leave the farm. He had had such a splendid time there, and felt that he had not seen half of the farm life. But Herr Runkel promised that he should come again the following summer, and spend the entire vacation with them, to which his parents consented, so the child was content. However, he was to visit his cousin Leopold, and that was always a treat, for Tyrol is so charming and so different from other spots in Austria. It would be a difficult child indeed to please, who would not be content with a trip to Tyrol. Herr Hofer and his son Leopold met them at the station in Innsbruck, with a heavy wagon and 2 strong horses. The Hofers lived in Wolders, in the Unter Inntal, or valley of the lower Inn river, some distance in the mountains, all the country to the north of the Inn being designated as the upper, and that to the south as the lower valley. "Have you had your luncheon?" asked Herr Hofer, as soon as the greetings were over. "Oh yes, we lunched on board the train," replied Herr Müller. "Then let's get off," said Herr Hofer, "for we have a long drive before us." He pulled his horse's reins, and the beasts started off at a good pace. Leaving the station, they turned down the Margaretplatz, with its fountain of dragons and griffins, where young women were filling their pitchers, for Innsbruck is very primitive in many of its customs. Down the broad and splendid Maria Theresa Strasse the carriage turned, and stopped before a most gorgeous palace, whose roof shone in the bright sunshine like molten metal. "Oh, uncle, who can live in such a beautiful house?" asked Ferdinand. "That is the Goldene Dachel, or the house with the golden roof," replied his uncle. "It was built ever so many years ago by our beloved Count Frederick of Tyrol. You've heard of him?" he queried. "Oh, yes," replied the lad, "but I don't know about this house of his." Well, Count Frederick was a most generous man. He would lend to all his friends who were not always very prompt in repaying him, and sometimes forget they owed him anything at all. At length his enemies began to call him the Count of Empty Pockets. This was very unjust, for poor Friedel, that's what we call him who love him, you know, had a very hard time of it indeed. His own brother had driven him from his throne and usurped it himself, and made it a crime for anyone to even shelter poor Friedel, who wandered about from place to place like the veriest vagabond. But at length he discovered that he had many friends who longed to show their devotion to him. He made a stand for his rights and secured his throne. But still, the nickname did not leave him. So, just to prove to his people that he was unjustly called the Count of the Empty Pockets, he ordered this wonderful roof of gold to be put on his palace. They say it cost him $70,000, which certainly was a great sum for a man with empty pockets. Turning the horses' heads in the opposite direction, Herr Hofer conducted them through the triumphal arch and gained the country road. "I thought to show the boys the Abbey of Wilton," explained Herr Hofer, as they trotted along, "and perhaps stop at Schloss Amras, as we may not have an opportunity soon again." "Oh, uncle," cried Ferdinand, "I love to see old ruins and castles. We have a lot of fine ones about Vienna, but they are all alike." "Well, this will be quite different, I can assure you," replied his uncle. The two boys occupied the rear seat with Frau Müller, while their fathers sat upon the front. And verily the little tongues wagged as only boys' tongues can do. In the midst of the spirited conversation the carriage stopped before a splendid old church. "Oh, father!" exclaimed Ferdinand, "what queer-looking men!" Herr Müller looked about, but saw no one. "Where?" he asked. "Why, there, by the sides of the church door." Both men laughed. "They are queer-looking, aren't they?" said Uncle Hofer. "But you would think it a lot queerer did you know how they came to be there." "Oh, tell us!" the boy exclaimed. "Well, once upon a time, way back in the Middle Ages, there were two giants who lived in different parts of the earth. Each of them was 12 feet or more tall. One was called Heimo, and the other Tirsus. Now, in those times, giants did not remain quietly in their strongholds. They set out on adventures. So it chanced that, in the course of their travels, these two mighty giants encountered each other right on this spot where this abbey stands. But of course there was no abbey here then. The ancient Roman town of Veldidena was hereabouts. Now, when the two giants met, they stopped, looked one at the other, and measured his strength. Well, it naturally fell about that they decided to prove their strength. In the struggle, sad to tell, Heimo killed Tirsus. Poor giant Heimo! Big as he was, he wept, for he had not meant to harm his giant comrade. At length, to ease his mind, he determined to build an abbey on the spot, as that seemed to be the solace for all evils in those days. And then Heimo would become a monk, and for 18 whole years he would weep and weep as penance for the deed. But poor Heimo had more than he bargained for. He did not know that the devil had claimed this same spot. No sooner did Heimo bring the stones for the foundation of his church than the devil came and pulled them down. But Heimo persisted, for he really must keep his vow, and evidently he conquered the devil himself, for the abbey stands, as you see, and these are the 2 statues of the giants guarding the portal of the church, so that the devil may not come, I suppose." "Poor Heimo," said Ferdinand. "What a hardship to weep for 18 years, nicht wahr, Leopold?" "Jawohl," came the stolid reply, while the 2 men chuckled softly. It is a peculiarity of Tyrol that, not until one attains middle age at least, does he begin to appreciate humor the least bit. Children are always too serious to admit of fun in their prosaic lives, so that, were it not for the elderly people, humor might eventually die out altogether in Tyrol, so serious a nation are they. "Shall we go inside, father?" asked Leopold. "We have not time. Night will overtake us, and we must go on to Schloss Amras yet. There really is little to see, however." And while the lads strained their necks and eyes to catch a glimpse of the beautiful paintings upon the outside walls of the abbey, the wonderful gilding and stucco, the horses disappeared around a bend in the road, and it was lost to sight. Now they commenced to climb, for the road is always up and up in Tyrol. Below them lay the wonderful view of Innsbruck, with the Inn running gaily along. There, too, was the fair abbey, with its 2 giants carved in stone, watching ever at the portal. "Have you boys any idea where we are?" asked Herr Hofer. Both shook their heads negatively. "All those country hereabouts is alive with interest attaching to Andreas Hofer, our patriot," replied he. "Here, at this very Gasthaus Inn, was where he made his last effort against the enemy. We shall learn more of it as we go along," he continued, "but there is not much use to stop here now. We go a few steps further to the Schloss." Truly, it was a delightful old place, this castle of Amras, one of the few feudal castles left. There was an old courtyard paved with great stones. There were battlements and towers and relics of Roman invasions. The guide led them through the castle, room after room, filled with the most interesting articles of every description pertaining to ancient times and wars, all of which intensely absorbed the boy's attention. "Oh, what an immense bowl!" cried Ferdinand. "And of glass! What is it for?" "That is the welcome bowl," replied the attendant. "We call it nowadays the loving cup. In every castle there were many like this. There was a gold one for ladies, a silver one for princes, and a glass one for knights, which latter was the largest of all. When guests came to the castle, the welcome bowl was brought out, filled to the brim, and handed to the guest, who was supposed to drink it off at a draught, if he was at all of hazardous or knightly disposition. To his undoing, it sometimes happened he did not survive the ordeal, but that mattered not at all to him. He had displayed his bravery, and that was worth life itself. After the bowl was drained, a great book was brought out, in which the guest was requested to write his name, no doubt as a test as to his real station, for no one but the highest and noblest were able to write or read in those times, and it often chanced even they were unable to do so. "Why, that is what they do in hotels," said Ferdinand. "Yes," replied the guide, "and probably that is where the custom originated, for the manager of a hotel but preserves the ancient custom of registering the names of his guests." All too soon the visit came to an end. The party made its way to the nearby inn to spend the night. End of chapter 5. Recording by Julian Niedermeyer. Chapter 6 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. More legends. The innkeeper, Herr Schmidt, was a big, raw-boned man with a red face and a jolly air. He was a genuine Wirt, or innkeeper of the old time, and after supper, as they all sat in the great Sitzsaal together, he told them wonderful tales of the country round about, which so abounded in legends and folklore. As the position of Wirt descends from father to son for generations back, as long as there remains any sons to occupy that honored position, naturally, too, the legends are passed from one to the other, so that no one is quite so well able to recite these as our hearty friend, Herr Schmidt. If it were not so late, remarked Herr Hofer, while the men sat and smoked their long, curious pipes, I should continue on to Wolders, for it looks as if tomorrow might be stormy. Oh, you need have no fear as to that, replied the host. I noticed Frau Hütte did not have her nightcap on. Ferdinand looked at his little cousin with his face so puckered up with glee and merriment that Leopold laughed outright. Do tell Ferdinand about Frau Hütte, father, said the child. No, I think Herr Wirt better able to do that. Bitte. And he saluted the innkeeper in deference. And have you never heard of Frau Hütte, my boy? Asked the host. No, sir, replied the boy. You know, I live in Vienna. Well, everybody knows her, replied the innkeeper. But then, you are a little young yet, so I will tell you. Very long ago, in the time of giants and fairies. But then, you don't believe in fairies, do you? And the fellow's eyes sparkled keenly. Oh, yes, I do, exclaimed the boy hastily, for fear if he denied the existence of such beings, he should miss a good story. Well, then, there was a queen over the giants, who was called Frau Hütte. Oh, interrupted the lad. Then she isn't a real person? Oh, yes, she was. But that was long ago, continued the storyteller. Well, Frau Hütte had a young son who was very much like any other child. He wanted whatever he wanted, and he wanted it badly. One day this giant child took a notion he should like to have a hobby horse. Without saying a word to anyone, he ran off to the edge of the forest and chopped himself a fine large tree. But evidently the child did not know much about felling trees, for this one fell over and knocked him into the mud. With loud cries he ran home to his mother. Instead of punishing him, she bade the nurse wipe off the mud with a piece of white bread. No one but the very richest could afford the luxury of white bread, black bread being considered quite good enough for ordinary consumption. So no wonder the mountain began to shake and the lightning to flash, just as soon as the maid started to obey her mistress' command. Frau Hütte was so frightened at this unexpected storm that she picked up her son in her arms and made for the mountain peak, some distance from her palace. No sooner had she left the palace than it disappeared from view, even to the garden, and nothing was ever seen of it again. But even in her retreat, the wasteful queen was not secure. When she had seated herself upon the rock, she became a stone image, holding her child in her arms. And there she sits to this day. When the clouds hover about her head, then we know there will be a storm. But when Frau Hütte does not wear her nightcap, and the Wirt's eyes sparkled, then we are certain of clear weather. Ever since then, the Tyrolese have made Frau Hütte the theme of a proverb. Spart eure Brotsamen für die Armen, damit es euch nicht ergehe wie der Frau Hütte. Which really means, spare your crumbs for the poor, so that you do not fare like Frau Hütte. A lesson to the extravagant. There were endless more stories, all of which delighted the boys immensely. But we could not begin to relate them all, for Tyrol is so overladen with the spirit of the past, and with the charm of legend, that the very air itself breathes of fairies and giants, and days of yore, so that in invading its territory one feels he is no longer in this work-a-day world, but in some enchanted spot. Early the next morning, up with the sun, all were ready for the drive home. As Herr Wirth had predicted, the day was fair. As they drove away from the inn, they caught a glimpse of Frau Hütte in the distance, beyond Innsbruck, and, sure enough, there she sat on her mountain peak, with her great son safely sheltered in her arms. "Shall we go to the salt mines, father?" asked Leopold, as they made their way along the mountain road. "No, we cannot take the time. Mother will be waiting for us, and the women folks are impatient to visit, I know." "They have wonderful salt mines at Salzburg," said Ferdinand. "Perhaps we may go there some time to visit them." "Perhaps," replied his father. "But, while we are on the subject, did it ever occur to you that Salzburg means the town or castle of salt? For, in the old times, all towns were within castle walls, to protect them from the predations of the enemy." "Isn't it curious?" meditated Ferdinand. The Inn River crossed, they continued to climb. Herr Hofer stopped to rest the horses. He glanced about him at the panorama below, and chuckled mirthfully. "What's the matter, uncle?" asked Ferdinand. "Oh, nothing much. But every time I see the towns of Hall and Tyrol, just over there," and he pointed with the handle of his whip, "I think of the Bauernkrieg." "But there isn't anything very funny about a war, is there, uncle?" asked the serious little fellow. "Well," rambled on his uncle, "there was about this one. You see, in early times, when Tyrol was not quite so peaceful as it is today, these two cities were most jealous of each other, and were always at feud. A watchman stood on the tower, day and night, to prevent any surprise from his neighbor. One night, in midsummer, and a very hot night it was too, the people of Hall were roused from their slumbers, if they had been able to sleep at all in such heat, by the voice of the watchman calling them to arms. 'What is the trouble, watchman?' cried one and all, as they appeared at the windows. 'Oh,' exclaimed the frightened fellow, 'hasten, friends, hasten! The whole town of Tyrol is at our gates, and not only are they advancing toward us, but each man boldly carries a lantern.' Such audacity was never heard of before. In utmost consternation the people gathered in the village square, and held a consultation. It was finally arranged that Herr Zott, the steward of the salt mine, and therefore a most important personage in the village, should meet the enemy with a flag of truce, and demand the reason for this unexpected attack. The inhabitants of Hall, in fear and trembling, awaited Herr Zott's return. The truce-bearer left the city gates and proceeded into the plain which separated their village from the enemy's. On and on he went, but not one soul did he meet. The great army of men, each carrying a lantern, had disappeared as if by magic. Finally he reached the walls of Tyrol, where all was as quiet as it should be at that time of the night. He turned his horse's head homeward. The night was very still, and over the plain flashed the lights of thousands of fireflies, reveling in the warm summer breeze. It was not until he had reached the very gates of his own town that Herr Zott realized what had caused all the excitement. The watchman had mistaken the fireflies for lanterns, and naturally, as someone must carry the lanterns, who more probable than their enemy, the people of Tyrol? The townsfolk betook themselves to their beds again, laughing heartily over the mistake, and even to this day we laugh over the incident which has become a byword in Tyrol, Bauernkrieg, or the Peasants' War. "But I don't see how peasants' war can mean anything now," said Ferdinand. "Well, when one becomes excited over nothing," returned his uncle, "they exclaim Bauernkrieg. Some day you will hear it, and then you will recollect the origin of it." Not long after this tale, the carriage stopped in front of a most charming home on the mountain-side. The first story was stuccoed, while across the entire front and two sides of the second and third stories ran a wide wooden balcony. Boxes of red and white geraniums decked the top of the fancy balustrade, while vines trailed themselves far over, giving the house a most homey appearance. The lower story receded far behind the overhanging second story, which formed a convenient space for sheltering the cattle. There is little available space in Tyrol for outbuildings, the mountains rising so precipitously that there is but little lever. But as stone floors separate the house from the stable, odours do not penetrate as much as one would imagine. At the front of the house stood a woman of middle age, her hair carefully drawn back under an immense head-dress, so tall it seemed as if she would be unable to enter the doorway. She wore a black skirt, so very full it had the appearance of being a hoop-skirt, but this effect was produced by her 10 extremely full petticoats. The reputation of a Tyrolese woman depends, in a great degree, to the number of petticoats she wears. Sometimes young girls, who value modesty highly, wear as many as 15 or more. Over the black skirt, which showed to advantage the white stockings and low shoes with the shining buckles of silver, was a most elaborately embroidered black apron, the work of many hours of tedious labour for the housewife. About her waist was twined a bright yellow sash, which brightened up the dark bodice, with its short sleeves tied fantastically with bright yellow ribbons. The woman nodded to the travellers. Herr Hofer pulled up his horses and descended from the carriage. "Well, meine liebe Frau, here we are," said he, as he greeted his wife. Such hugging as followed! Ferdinand was clasped, time and again, against the ample bosom of Frau Hofer, and even Herr Müller came in for a goodly share, while as for the greeting that Frau Müller received, no words may convey its warmth. The party made its way up the narrow stairway, with carved balustrade, which led from the ground floor to the second story, upon the outside of the house. This is the most convenient manner of building staircases in Tyrol, because it does not drag mud and dirt through the corridors, and saves much interior space. The guest-room was certainly restful-looking. Its dark, polished floor of pine had been newly polished until it fairly radiated. The big bed of wood, painted a vivid color of green, also had received scrupulous polishing. 2 small home-made rugs, one at the bedside, the other at the wash-stand, had been scrubbed and beaten until it seemed as if there would be nothing left of them. At the side of the canopied bed stood a tiny footstool. The Tyrolese beds, being extremely high, make the use of a stool necessary. No doubt the object of this is to avoid draughts, as none of the floors are carpeted, many being of cement. Immaculate white curtains hung at the casement window, those dear little windows unlike anything we have in America, which open into the room and give such a cosy character to the home. A basin of holy water was hung in its accustomed place, and the image of the Virgin hung over the table, for, you must know, the Tyrolese are devout Roman Catholics, as, in fact, are nearly all the natives of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. End of Chapter 6. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 7. of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Night with the Senna. Merry days followed. There were excursions almost every day. Ferdinand and Leopold would spend part of the time picking flowers on the mountain-sides, or would help with the cattle and in the garden, so that their elders might be able to devote more time to recreation with their guests. One morning the two men and boys set out with rucksacks on their shoulders and long alpenstocks in their hands to climb the mountain and visit an Alp in the pasture lands, for in the summer-time the cows of the neighboring villages are driven to pasture in charge of a few attendants, sometimes men, called Senner, sometimes women, called Sennerin, where they remain during the entire season. "Have you never seen the Sennerei, Ferdinand?" asked his cousin. "Oh, yes. Don't you remember the last time I was here?" replied Ferdinand. "We saw them drive the cattle away." "But I said the Sennerei, dairy," repeated the child. "No, but I should love to see the cheeses made. The Alps look so picturesque." "Well, they aren't quite so nice when you reach them," admitted his cousin. "However, we are not going specially to see the dairy, but the dance which the Senner have on Saturday night. Oh, it's great!" "Do they have one every Saturday night?" "Very near, as long as the season lasts. It's wonderful, Ferdinand. I've seen some of the fellows do the most astonishing tricks." Of course, such conversation stimulated the city lad's desire to a great pitch, and it was with the keenest joy he tramped over the Rocky Mountains, which was difficult for him. But he said nothing. He kept before his mind the delights of the dance he should witness, and plodded on. At length they reached the first Alp, or chalet, as the huts which serve for sleeping-room and dairy for the Senner are called. These chalets are built at different heights up the mountain. When the cattle have eaten all the green grass available at one level, they are driven to the next higher pasture, and so on until, towards the beginning of November, they return to the village for the winter. Picturesque as the Alp may look from the distance, it is scarce one of grandeur upon closer view. It consists of a low wooden hut, usually of one room, and a sort of adjoining alcove. In the main room is a bunk built against the wall. Nothing but straw serves for the mattress. There are no coverlets except the blanket the Senner always carries with him, and in which he wraps himself. In another part of this uninviting room is a hollow space where the fire is built, over which hangs a great cane and an iron pot for use in making the cheeses so famous throughout Tyrol. The alcove serves as a storeroom for the cheeses and for the dairy, while off to one end is sometimes a room for such cattle as are ill or young cattle who must be protected from the chill night air of the mountain. As evening advanced, from all directions came merry voices, ringing the clear notes of yodels from over the mountain-side. Each Sennerin knows the peculiar yodel of her swain, and you may be sure her heart beats light when she hears, miles and miles away, the beautiful, clear notes of his call. This is the only method the mountaineers have of communicating with each other. The peculiar notes carry across ravines and hillsides as distinctly as if one were close at hand. "Oh, father," said Ferdinand, as he touched him upon the elbow, "what queer-looking men these are! I have not seen such costumes about here. Do they belong to Tyrol?" "Yes, but these men are from the south, from Meran. When a man is married he must distinguish himself by placing a green cord about his head, so that he may not allow folks to think him single. We other Austrians wear the wedding ring, the same as the women, but in the different provinces customs vary." Ferdinand watched the different costumes of the men as they poured in from all directions. There were some in brown jackets trimmed with red, and white-brown suspenders. All Tyrolese men wear these white suspenders, sometimes of one color, sometimes of another, but usually green, of which color they are passionately fond, no doubt because their country is so wonderfully green. Most of the men wore knee trousers of leather, while some were of homespun, but that was an extravagance. Their stockings, usually grey and home-knitted, reached from the ankle to just below the knee, leaving the latter bare. Without exception, all wore the Tyrolese cap of rough green cloth, at the back of which was the black cock's tail, while one or two isolated fellows were fortunate enough to deck their heads with the gumspot, or beard of the chamois, as it is called. But this is not the correct name for it, as it is not the beard of the chamois, but the long tuft which grows upon his back in the winter. On the green of the mountain-side, in a spot selected for its advantage of being as near level as possible, the dance took place. The Senner and Sennerin went through manoeuvres that did them credit. They swung each other in giddy fashion until one almost believed they would spin themselves down the mountain-side, and thus dance to their deaths. But after whirling at great speed for many minutes, they would suddenly pull up with a jerk, and seem none the worse for the whirling. It was no unusual sight for Ferdinand to see the Tyrolese dances, but here on the pasture lands, on their native heath, he saw them perform many which were most unfamiliar to him. He always smiled when he saw the women place their arms about their partners' necks, and waltz in that fashion, and then, when a couple separated, the women to dance round and round, holding out their full skirts to their greatest width, while the men indulged in all sorts of fantastic gymnastics, was truly bewildering. At length the evening drew to a close. The company dispersed as quickly as it had assembled, and all was quiet upon the mountain-side. One might have imagined himself back to the days of old Rip Van Winkle. So mysterious did the entire proceeding seem. In the morning the party descended the mountain. The air was very clear, although the day was cloudy, the sun steadfastly refusing to appear. But this made walking agreeable, for which all were thankful. "Did you ever hear so many bells in your life?" observed the city cousin. "Oh, those are the cow-bells," replied Leopold. "Each herd has its own peculiar tone, so that the cattle won't get mixed up, where there are so many together, and then the senner can tell right away to which owner they belong. But there is such a constant tinkling, and so many different tones, I don't see how one can ever tell which is his own," replied the lad. "That is because you are not used to it," answered his uncle. "After you have been on the mountain a while, you too would be able to distinguish your own bell as well as the senner in charge." And to the tinkling of the bells the party descended, until they were well out of reach of the bewitching sounds. End of Chapter 7. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 8 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Through the Tyrolese mountains. When the pedestrians reached home in the early afternoon, a letter was awaiting Herr Müller. It was from Herr Runkel, stating he was obliged to make a visit to Dalmatia to see his younger brother Max on business, and if Herr Müller would care to make the trip with him, he would meet him in Villach in Carinthia the following Tuesday. Of course, there was new excitement now for the boys. The one wished to go with his father, while the other was urgent in his demands that the cousin remain with him. Finally it was arranged that both boys should accompany Herr Müller, while Frau Müller should remain with her relatives and join her husband and son at Graz in Styria on their return. Leopold had never made a journey from home before, except the one time he had been to Innsbruck, quite recently, to meet his Müller relations, so you may be certain there was one little heart which beat faster than normal. "We shall leave to-morrow, then," decided Herr Müller. "If you think you can be ready in that time," he added, addressing the Tyrolese youngster. because we shall want to visit some of the mountain towns, and if you boys want to see anything of Tyrol, we had better walk than take the train." "Oh, I could be ready to-night," ventured the child, delighted beyond measure. But his uncle assured him that morning would be ample time, and the two lads skipped away to talk over the plans. As the sun was just beginning to peep above the mountain top, the party of three set off, with many admonitions from Frau Hofer to her child, and many also from Frau Müller, that Ferdinand should not allow his cousin to be too adventuresome. But to this Leopold smiled. "I'm used to the mountains, auntie," he said. "Ferdinand will tire long before I do, you'll see." How glorious it was to tramp thus, in vagabond fashion, over the mountains. They stopped wherever night overtook them, passed through Brixen, the wine centre of much importance in Tyrol, and on through narrow defiles, through which there seemed no exit. A bracing walk of 6 miles from Brixen brought them to Klausen, or the pass, so completely hidden among mountains there was but room for one long, narrow street. "Well, I had no idea Klausen was quite so narrow," Herr Müller remarked. "I can well believe the tale of the barber now." "What barber, uncle?" asked Leopold. "The barber of Klausen. You have never heard it? Well, there once lived a barber in this town, who was old and full of rheumatism. He had a client whom he must shave every morning, but the poor barber found it very difficult to descend 3 flights of steps from his dwelling and ascend 3 more on the opposite side of the street in order to shave his customer. He could not afford to lose this fee, yet it was exceedingly painful for him to attempt the climb. One morning he opened his window and called to his neighbor. Upon hearing the barber's voice, the man in the opposite house opened his window and asked what was wanted. "Allow me," said the ingenious barber. "I am unable to descend the stairs this morning. My rheumatism is getting the better of me. But, in order that you may not lose your shave, if you will lean a little way out of your window, I shall be able to accomplish the duty quite as well as though you were sitting in your chair in your room." For a moment the man hesitated, but as the village was small and there was but one barber, it was either a question of going unshaved or of following the fellow's advice. Accordingly he consented. He stretched his neck far out of the window, the barber placed a towel beneath his chin, and, with all the dexterity in his power, he proceeded to shave his client, and thenceforth the barber performed his operation in a similar manner, quite to the satisfaction of them both. They passed on through the village of Weidbruck, the very centre of romanticism, for here, right at the mouth of the Grodener Thal, rises the fascinating castle of Trostburg, the home of the Counts of Wolkenstein, and here was born Count Oswald, the last of all the long line of Minnesingers, or troubadours, who found employment and enjoyment in wandering from castle to castle, their harps or zithers under their arms, singing love songs or reciting war stories that stirred the young blood to action. They climbed to the magnificent castle of Hauerstein, so hidden among the mountain peaks and dense woods that one might imagine it to be the palace of the Sleeping Beauty, and then they diverged a few miles up the ravine in order to visit Santa Claus's shops, for such might be called the village of St. Ulrich, with its countless numbers of toy shops. In every cottage, men, women, and young children busy themselves from morning until night, from one year's end to the other, in making toys, carved animals for Noah's Ark, dolls and wagons to supply the world's demand of the children. Here, too, the very language is different from any other spoken round about, for the inhabitants, primitive in language as in everything else, still cling to the tongue of the Romans, which is today known as the Ladin or Romansch tongue. They passed the night at Bozen, and, as the sun sank behind the lofty mountains just beyond, a gorgeous glow overspread their entire summit. "Isn't it beautiful?" remarked the two lads, almost at the same moment. "And it looks just like a rose garden, too," added Leopold. "It is a rose garden, child," answered Herr Müller. "It is called the Rosengarten, or Gardel, little garden." "But is it possible, father," asked Ferdinand, "that roses will bloom on such lofty heights?" "Well, this is the legend about it. Once upon a time there lived an ugly dwarf who was king over all the underground sprites and elves in the mountains of Tyrol. He was in the habit of going forth from his palace wrapped in a magic cloak which rendered him invisible. Now it chanced that during one of these expeditions Laurin went into the country of Styria, which lies right over there to the east. We shall pass that way on our return to Vienna. He saw a most beautiful maiden who was playing in a meadow with her attendants. Suddenly she disappeared from before the very eyes of her companions. They shouted, but no answer came back to them. In great dismay they fled back to the castle to report the news to the prince's brother, Dietlieb. Dietlieb had heard of Laurin and his propensity for carrying off fair maidens. Dietlieb was a brave knight and had travelled far, so as soon as he had heard the news, he suspicioned at once that Laurin had done the deed. Immediately he set out for the city of Bern, where the king held his court, to demand that the dwarf be punished for his insolence. But the king was powerless against Laurin's magic. However, he warned Dietlieb not to attempt to approach too near the dwarf's domains, for it was guarded by 4 magnificent pillars of shining gold, and a fence of silken thread stretched between. "Remember," said the king, "should you happen to break so much as one strand of Laurin's fence, he will demand the forfeit of a foot and a hand." In hot rage, Dietlieb left the king's palace. What mattered to him Laurin's magic powers, if only he could recover his dear sister, the Princess Kunhild? With a few faithful companions he set out over the mountains until he reached the rose garden before the dwarf's underground abode, the very sight of which so enraged the worthy knight that he tore away the silken threads and destroyed the 4 gorgeous pillars. Within his subterranean palace Laurin heard the destruction without. He mounted his war horse, and putting on his magic belt, which endowed him with supernatural strength, he appeared at the door of the cave, covered with sparkling jewels from head to foot. "Who has dared to enter my domains," he shouted, "and to destroy my garden? Let him who has done the deed stand forth, and I may exact the punishment." "Be not so hasty, Sir Laurin," replied one of the knights. "We will gladly repay you 3-4-fold, if you wish what you demand. The season is early, and your roses will bloom again." "I care not for your gold," replied the indignant king. "I have gold and to spare. I demand satisfaction, and satisfaction I shall have." So saying, he spurred on his horse. There was a hotly contested battle. In the end he was overpowered by Dietlieb, who had torn from him his magic belt, and thus robbed him of his strength. "Come," said Laurin, "let us not harbor ill feelings against one another. Come into my palace, Sir Knights, and drink to the health of the fair Kunhild." He led them through the door of the cave, down several long corridors, at the end of each of which was a stout door, one of bronze, another of steel, and a third of gold, and entered the banquet hall, where the table was gorgeously decorated with gold and silver and most rare flowers. As the dinner drew to a close, at which Kunhild had presided, dazzling with jewels, the knights fell into a sound doze. When they awoke, each was locked securely in a separate cell, with no means of communicating one with the other. But when all was still, Kunhild entered her brother's dungeon and released him by the aid of her magic arts, which she had learned while captive. "Take this ring," she said. "Gather up your weapons, and flee for your life." "But will you go with me?" he said. "I will come later," she replied. "But make your escape now, before Laurin discovers us." Dietlieb did not require a second bidding. The magic of Laurin had penetrated through the stone walls of the cell, however, and he followed the knight to the outer earth, and there they fought a terrible battle. When Laurin found himself yielding to the superior strength of the knight, he blew a shrill blast upon his golden horn, and 5 enormous giants appeared. Meanwhile Gunhild had not been idle. She had released the companions of her brother, who now rushed to the scene of the fray, and in spite of his magic arts and his reinforcement of the 5 giants, Laurin was made prisoner and carried off into Styria. The garden was left uncared for, and little by little it died. But on just such evenings as this, one can see the gorgeous roses which will bloom only as the sun descends. "Do you think, father," said Ferdinand, "that there is really an underground palace in those mountains?" "Well, that's what they say. Many have tried to find the entrance, but the key has been lost. Some day one may be fortunate enough to find it, and then great riches will be his. It is my private opinion that within those mountains lie metals unknown to exist, and when one has opened the door to them he will discover great riches in them." "I should like to gather just one rose, uncle," said Leopold. "I think mother would like to have one, for she has never seen the Rosengarten." "You cannot do that, my boy, because they are not real roses. The rocks of the mountain are composed of magnesia and chalk, which take on these beautiful colors when the rays of the setting sun fall upon them, and it is only the sharp, jagged points of those rocks which simulate roses that you see." Another knight would see them out of Tyrol, much to the regret of Ferdinand, for he had never imagined such an interesting land to exist. "How did Tyrol come to belong to our country, father?" asked Ferdinand. "Well, in the olden times," answered Herr Müller, "Tyrol was governed by counts who ruled like kings. But in 1363 a princess was ruler. She was a woman with a very hasty temper, and was nicknamed Pocket-mouthed Mag. Some say she received this nickname because her mouth was so extraordinarily large, but others tell a tale of a Bavarian cousin, who lived in the adjoining territory, who struck her on the mouth during a quarrel. It certainly was not a very gentlemanly thing for the Bavarian cousin to do, but children were not brought up so carefully as they are today, and you must not think too harshly of this little Bavarian, which sounds quite like barbarian. But Queen Margaret could never forgive nor forget that blow. In after years, when her own son was dead, and her kingdom must be left to someone, she preferred to give it to her Habsburg cousins, who were Austrians, so that ever since, with the exception of a few years in which several nations struggled for possession of it, it has belonged to the Austrian Empire. You know Emperor Maximilian I, who was one of our greatest rulers, loved Tyrol best of all his provinces," continued Herr Müller. "I don't blame him," replied Ferdinand. "I think he was quite right." End of Chapter 8. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 9 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Der Habichtburg Ravens. From Bozen, the train took them through the Pustertal, which is on the north boundary of Italy, and on to Villach in Carinthia, where they were to meet Herr Runkel. There were great demonstrations when he saw the 2 young lads. "Have you never been to Dalmatia?" he asked them. Both shook their heads negatively. "What a splendid thing, then, that business called me to Zara," he replied. "For Dalmatia is one of the provinces of our empire which is different from many of the others. You see, in the first place, it is on the Adriatic Sea, and could one have vision that would carry that far, he might glance over into the opposite country of Italy. But, as if to make up for the lack of supernatural power,
Italy has brought her customs and manners into Dalmatia, so we shall really be seeing 2 countries at one time." Through Carinthia the party made its way over the Karawanken Mountains into Istria, and spent the night at Trieste. As neither of the boys had seen the sea before, it was a never-ending source of wonder and delight to them to wander about the wharves, to see the ships of many nations lying in the harbor, flying their flags of many colors, and to see the curious sights of a sea-town. There was nothing to remind them of Austria with its German customs, even the name of the city, Tergeste, being Roman, which was conquered by the nation and colonized about 41 B.C. There are no longer Straßen, streets, but vias, and piazzas, squares, take the place of Platz. As in most Italian cities, there were narrow, winding streets, some of which were nothing more than a mere flights of steps lined on each side in place of a balustrade with houses. In the morning it had been arranged to make a hasty trip to Miramar, the charming residence of the Archduke Maximilian, the favorite brother of the Emperor. "Here it is," said Herr Müller, "that the ominous ravens warned the Archduke of the fatality which should overtake him in accepting the throne of Mexico at the instance of Napoleon III of France. And the ravens' warning came true, for the unfortunate young prince never returned." "Tell us about the ravens, father," said Ferdinand, as they stood upon the terrace before the villa, overlooking the wonderful Adriatic. "Well, you know the House of Habsburg occupies the Austrian throne to-day," began Herr Müller. "Jawohl," replied the two simultaneously. "Well, many hundreds of years ago, the founder of the Habsburg dynasty, Count Rudolf, was born in a very ancient and formidable castle in the northern part of Switzerland, somewhere near Zurich. The castle was known throughout the country by the peculiar name of the Hawk's Castle, or Habichtburg, from a story concerning one of the first counts who lived there. This was Count Gontran of Altenburg. He was a brave and gallant knight, and loved to spend his time among the mountains hunting, when he was not away to the war. As he was so fearless in his sport, pursuing his enemy to the remotest spots of the lairs, he gained the sobriquet of the Hawk Count, or the Habichtgraf. One day he had climbed to the top of a most peculiarly shaped rock, which much resembled a fortress. In his eagerness to reach the summit, he had lost sight of his companions, but in his joy at the marvelous panorama spread beneath him, he quite forgot all about them, and gave himself up only to the spell of the wildness surrounding him. Suddenly the air grew thick with moving objects, the sun was hidden from sight, and then the Count realized that numberless vultures, whose habitation he had invaded, had gathered about the rock in swarms, waiting for their time to come when they might claim him their victim. But the Habichtgraf was no craven. He made no attempt to fight. Well he knew they would not attack him until he had passed that stage when he would be able to defend himself. All at once, while he thus stood defying his antagonists, a shrill cawing was heard on all sides. In a few moments the air was filled with innumerable ravens, who seemed to have appeared from out the very heavens, so silently and unexpectedly had they come. There was a sharp battle between the two swarms, the smaller birds being able to drive off the larger on account of the greater numbers. And then, when all vestige of both feathered tribes had disappeared, Count Gontran was able to find his way down the almost inaccessible rock, where he joined his companions at its base, who had given him up for lost, as the shouts had failed to reach him, and no answering call came back to them. From that day the Habichtgraf chose the raven for his pennon. He became their protector, feeding them in winter, until, as time went on, they became verily a pest. The Habichtgraf died, and others came into possession of the Habichtburg. There was little sentiment in these descendants concerning the ravens, and when Count Rudolf succeeded to the estate in 1230, he had them all driven away or killed. Ever since that time, the birds have taken a peculiar delight in foretelling disaster to the house of Habsburg, as Habichtburg has been corrupted into. And right here, in this garden, continued Herr Müller, was where the ravens came and flew about the heads of the Archduke Maximilian and his young wife Carlotta, before they left on the fatal journey. What happened then, father? Surely you must know. The Mexicans refused to accept a foreign ruler. He was sentenced to be shot, and although Carlotta made the trip to France 3 times to beg Napoleon III to save her husband, the emperor was deaf to all her appeals. That was because Napoleon was not born a king, father, remarked Ferdinand. Had he been truly royal, he would have saved Maximilian. Herr Müller made no further comment, but shook his head slowly in an affirmative nod. From Trieste, the boat was taken to Pola, one of the oldest cities in the country, quite at the extreme tip of Istria. Although the Romans built a city here in 178 BC, yet many of the ancient landmarks remain, among which, outside the ancient city walls, stands the splendid amphitheatre, where gladiators fought and wild beasts contended with human beings for supremacy. As Herr Runkel was obliged to make Zara on a specific day, they were not permitted to linger in the Istrian peninsula, with its almost continuous olive groves and vineyards, famous throughout the world. But boarding a small steamer, they slowly made their way to the sea-coast town of Zara in Dalmatia, stretching like a lizard along the Adriatic. No longer was there sign of modernism or progress. Every object, every peasant spoke of the past, of long-flown glory, and of poverty. One could almost imagine himself back in those days, 600 or more years before Christ, when the Argonauts inhabited the spot, and who, in turn, ceded to the Celts, and they to the inevitable Romans. Then Charlemagne coveted Dalmatia. Later, the influential Venetians wrested it from the Germans, and in 1798 it was finally ceded to Austria, to whom it has ever since belonged, except for a short period when it belonged to France. The peasants were gorgeous in their gay costumes. There were men in light-colored trousers, very tight-fitting, laced with fancy cords of gold or silver thread, and most elaborately embroidered about the pockets in the front. There were short jackets of bright cloth, designed in intricate fashion in tinsel thread, with tassels about the edges. There were women with blue skirts, very short, over which was an apron so heavily embroidered that it seemed more like an oriental rug than a bit of cloth, while the bodice was one mass of embroidery. Every conceivable spot was embroidered: about the neck, the shoulders, down the front, and at the wrists. There was color, 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 fringes and tassels and gold thread, as if these poor gewgaws could make up to the peasant for all the poverty he suffered and the monotony of his life. But how charming they did look in their apparel! If their lives were not the sunniest, they surely tried to embody the very sunlight into their clothing, and that helps a lot, for they were never so happy as when decked in their gayest, wearing the handmade filigree silver ornaments about their necks, in their ears, and upon their fingers, even about their waists, which no persuasion nor hunger can prevail upon them to part with. Herr Runkel's younger brother Max was an apprentice in Zara. His term was about to expire, and some arrangement must be made for the future. It was this which had brought Herr Runkel to Zara, while he was busy with his brother's affairs, the rest of the party wandered about the ancient city. They visited the market-place, alive and riotous with brilliant colouring. They inspected the wharves, and commented upon St. Mark's Lion, which reposed over the entrance gate from the harbour, in the city wall, a relic of Venetian invasion, as if that stone lion was yet watching for the return of his people. They even crossed over to the islands, which lie like so many bits of broken mainland, to watch the fishing which is so remunerative, the sardine fishery being one of the greatest sources of revenue of the country. His business terminated satisfactorily, Herr Runkel suggested they might return by way of the provinces of Bosnia, Croatia, and Styria, because these held such wonders in sightseeing for the children. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Julie Niedermeyer. Chapter 10 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Through Dalmatia and the Borderlands. Early the following morning they made their start, packs on backs, over the low wastelands of Dalmatia. The sun was burning hot. Nothing but extensive plains of desert met the eye. Far in the distance were low mountains, which glistened in the scorching sun with a startling whiteness, most dazzling to the eyes. There was a sameness about the landscape which wearied the boys. "I certainly should not like to live here," remarked Leopold. "It is not so nice as Tyrol. There is too much barrenness, and too much dazzling whiteness." "Nevertheless," replied his uncle, "this is a fine country. The wine and olive oil are famous the world over, to say nothing of the fruit and flowers. If you did but stop to think about it, most of the fruit and flowers we have in Vienna, out of season, come from this region." "But how can anything grow in a desert?" "We shall soon see," replied his uncle. "Dalmatia looks baked, but it is extremely productive." After some time the soil began to grow more and more irregular. Great stones lay upon the surface, and immense fissures opened up at irregular distances. "Now, my boy, can you call this a desert?" asked Herr Müller. "Here are the gardens of Dalmatia." "The gardens?" exclaimed both children. "Yes, but I see nothing but great ravines," said Leopold. "They are not ravines, child, but great cracks opened up in the swampy soil which has burst asunder from the terrific heat of the sun. But that is what saves the country from starvation. On the bottom of these fissures are deposits of fertile soil washed into them by the rains, and here the peasant plants his crops. Here you see one too narrow to plant anything in, but over there," and he pointed to the immediate right, "is one which stretches a mile or more." "How interesting!" exclaimed Ferdinand. "But what a queer place to plant crops!" At the farmhouse, a low, uninviting hut with thatched roof, they stopped to fill their flasks. The farmer led them to the rear of the house, where was a huge tank of stagnant water. "But we cannot drink that," said Herr Runkel, astonished. "It is all there is," remarked the peasant. "In Dalmatia we drink rainwater. It is all we have. There are no streams in Dalmatia except in the mountains, and often those are underground." "Underground!" cried Ferdinand. "How do you get the water, then?" "Oh, the water runs along the limestone until it meets with some obstruction, or when it deems it time to appear upon the surface. Then it will flow on in a fine stream for some distance, when perhaps it will disappear again for a while." "I never heard of such a thing," said Leopold, to whom water was so very plentiful in Tyrol. "It is a wise precaution of nature," answered the peasant. "In these hot lands, Were it not for this provision, the streams would soon dry up." "But why don't you convey this water from the mountains to your home?" asked Herr Müller. "That costs too much. We have no money to spend on luxuries. We have the rain, and we gather the water as it falls." Walking on, having thanked the peasant for his courtesy, they came in sight of a convent. "Now we shall have some fresh water, I am bound," said Herr Müller. "Convents are always well supplied with refreshments of all kinds." A friar in brown costume opened the door to them and ushered them into a cool courtyard, paved with brick, in which were small openings at regular intervals. At a well in the center of the court the flasks were filled with delicious, clear, cool water. "It surprises me," said Herr Runkel, "that you have such delicious water here, while just below, a mile or two, the peasant told us there was no water available for miles around, except rain water." "He is quite right, too," returned the affable friar. "If it were not for the rain, we should all perish. But the peasant does not take the pains to collect the rain in just the same manner as we do." He then explained to them the method of obtaining the drinking water. The earth under the brick pavement was dug out to the depth of several feet. The sides and bottom were lined with some hard substance, sometimes clay, sometimes cement, to form a foundation to the cistern. In the middle of the pit was built a well of brick. Fine, clean sand was then put into the level of the court. The brick pavement was then laid through the openings of which the rain passed into the bed of sand, and, as it seeped through the brick well, eventually the sand filtered the water from all impurities and imparted to it a taste, without which it would have been flat. A brief rest, and some slight refreshment, upon which the friar insisted, and the travellers plodded on. They passed peasants pushing crude wooden ploughs, such as have been in use since long forgotten ages, but which seem specially adapted to the rocky, stubborn soil of Dalmatia. And being so close to the border of Bosnia, they encountered Bosnian peasants, fine, tall men, much like Turks in their costumes, for Turkey lies just next door on the south. The Bosnian Mohammedan women veil their faces like the Turkish women, and wear white garments with an apron of many colors, not outdoing, however, the men with their gold-embroidered vests, their scarlet jackets, and the fez upon their heads. A curious contrariety of nature is, that although the Bosnians and Herzegovinians dislike the Turk, nevertheless they cling to the Turkish costume with pertinacity. So deep was the hatred of the Turk that these two provinces combined and placed themselves under the Austrian rule. As night approached, the travellers made their way towards a very large, low house surrounded with outbuildings, and all enclosed by a strong palisade of timbers built for defence. "We shall pass the night at the community house," said Herr Runkel. "A community house?" repeated Leopold. "Yes. You see, in the olden times, the borders of this country and the neighboring ones, Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and Romania, were constantly being overrun by the Turks, who have always been the dread of nations, their cruelty being proverbial. The inhabitants of these border countries were forced to protect themselves, as in unity was their strength. Consequently, they built a community or general house, in which the villagers might live together for mutual protection and mutual benefit as well." "But they don't have wars to fear any more, do they?" asked Ferdinand. "No. Nevertheless, custom of long standing cannot be lightly laid aside. Our Empress, Maria Theresa, seeing the advantage these communities afforded as a means of defence, had a long line of them built, 7,000 miles long, from the Carpathian Mountains on the east of Transylvania to the sea-coast in Croatia, to protect the border from the Turks. But now these fortifications have been abandoned. However, isolated communities remain, being a part of the customs of Serbia, and you will find them vastly different from anything you have yet seen. It was quite late in the afternoon. The sun had not yet sunk, because the days were at their longest. However, it was certainly dinner time, if not past, and the party were hungry. Knocking at the door of the largest and most important-looking building, which was of timber and one story only, it was opened by a young man in Serbian costume, who ushered them into the room. It was an enormous room, to say the least. In the center extended a wooden table, set for the evening meal, and about which were already seated the inhabitants of the community. The eldest man had the honor to be, at the time, the stareshina, or Hausvater, arose from his seat and greeted the strangers. "And may we have the honor of receiving you as our guests?" he asked, simply. Herr Runkel thanked him, and explained that they were on a tour of the provinces with the lads, and should be most grateful for a night's shelter. Room was made for them at the table, and right heartily were they received by the Zadruga, or community family. The two boys were lost in admiration of all they saw, and although they were plied with cheeses and meats and bread, and even fruits of all kinds, yet their hunger seemed to have left them in their wonderment. At one end of the great room was a brick stove, or sort of fireplace, the largest either of the lads had ever seen. To carry off the smoke from the blazing logs was built a huge canopy, round and very large at the bottom, tapering to a small circumference at the top, and allowing the smoke to escape through the open roof at that point. Over the fire, but high enough to prevent them being burned, were crossbeams, from which hung huge pieces of beef, bacons, hams, and all sorts of meat smoking for future use, while the cooking was done in huge pots of iron suspended by chains from the beams. The women were dressed in white linen bodices with long, flowing sleeves. Their skirts were a combination of two wide aprons, one at the front and one at the back, over which was another smaller apron, elaborately embroidered in brilliant colors. About their waists were scarlet sashes, with a second, somewhat higher up, of the same brilliant hue, red leather high boots, filigree silver ornaments or beads about the necks, and on their heads a filmy veil, with fancy border fastened to the hair with a silver pin, and hanging far down over their shoulders like a mist. In this most picturesque costume they certainly resembled our scarlet flamingo or bird of paradise, more than anything else one could think of. The men, too, were splendid in their gay costumes. Loose trousers like Turks, with top boots of black leather, scarlet vests embellished with silver thread and silver buttons, and white coats, very long, reaching almost to the boots. The meal finished, the stareshina, the presiding elder of the Zadruga, and his wife, the domaćina, which means homekeeper, arose and thus gave the signal for the others to arise. Those women whose allotted work it was to attend to the clearing of the table betook themselves to the task. The domaćina arranges all the work to be done by each during the week, and turn about is taken so that there may be no cause for dissatisfaction, while the stareshina attends to the matters of the farm. Thus harmony always prevails. Prosperity reigns wherever these communities are established, and happiness is paramount. Although there seemed no apparent necessity for a fire, fresh logs were added. The men burned out their pipes, drew up the benches toward the hearth, and began conversation. Some brought their musical instruments. The women sat with the spinning or sewing, while the little girls even were occupied with elaborate embroideries for the trousseau later in life, which always began in childhood. There was great unity and happiness in the circle. Amid laughter, song, and anecdotes, the evening passed. As the hour advanced, the stareshina conducted evening prayers. Good night was said by all, and each family betook himself to his own vayat, hut, outside the main building, or koja, which alone was reserved for the use of the stareshina and the unmarried members of his family. As soon as one of his family should marry, he would have a separate vayat built for him about the koja. the travellers were conducted to the guest-house, reserved solely for that purpose, and long into the night the children lay and talked over the strange customs they had seen, and plied their elders with endless questions as to the meaning of it all. "Let them be children, Fred," said Herr Runkel. "We brought them on this trip to learn." And he explained to them those things they wished so much to know, that the Slavs never allowed the hearth-fire to die out, no matter how hot the season, for, as surely as they do, all sorts of evils would befall them. That is one of the unswerving superstitions of the nation. The fire of their hearth is a sacred flame to them, which must be tended and cared for with unremitting zeal, which harks back to the days of paganism, when a fire was looked upon as the most sacred thing in their religion, and was kept ever burning in their temples and public places. Finally, it became the custom for each family to have his own hearth or fire, but the superstition that should it die out it would bring all sorts of maledictions upon the household has remained. No doubt the difficulty of obtaining the fire by means of friction, matches of course being unknown, accounted for the careful preservation of the flame. However it be, the Slavs still retain the ancient custom. He explained to them how the house-father and the house-mother of this great family are elected by vote, serving a given number of years, sometimes one, sometimes more, as custom establishes, but usually the eldest man in the community holds that post of honor, while his wife is the house-mother. He told the lads how the farm is worked by each member of the Zadruga, under the supervision and instruction of the Stareshina, each receiving his share, according to his labor, at the end of the season, the finances being in charge of the house-father. He told them how many of the young men, longing for higher education at the universities or in the arts, such as painting, etc., were sent by the Zadruga to the city, which afforded the best advantages for them, the expenses being borne by the community funds, should they not be sufficient to the young man's credit to pay for it entirely, this extra sum being repaid when the students should be in position to do so. The children were fascinated with the community, where everyone seemed so happy and well cared for, and they begged to be allowed to remain many days, but Herr Müller reminded them that Frau Müller would be awaiting them at Graz. "But we shall come again, nicht wahr, mein Vater?" asked Ferdinand. "Yes, we shall come again, and soon maybe," he replied. "And I too?" queried Leopold. "Natürlich." Off in the morning, the party journeyed through the southeastern portion of Carniola, so rich in mountains and minerals. There were unusual sights to be seen here, too. Huge caverns were fashioned in the rocks, and grottos of curious formations. They saw the peasant women making lace, a product for which the province is particularly famed. At Marburg, Herr Runkel and Leopold Hofer bade farewell to their companions, and boarded a train for Innsbruck, where Herr Hofer would meet his young son, while Herr Müller and Ferdinand continued on up into Styria to the city of Graz, where Frau Müller awaited them. Styria, or Steiermark, is a splendid province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, famous even in the time of the Romans for its production of ore, and holding today an important place in the commercial world for its minerals. Graz, the capital, is a charming city with an excellent university, and lies on the river Mur. It has been said of it that it is la ville de Grâce sur la rivière de l'amour, the favored city on the river of love, being a play upon words, amour, love, being interpreted Mur. Of course, there was an excursion to the castle hill, where formerly stood the ancient castle, and Herr Müller pointed out to the children the spot where Charles II ordered 20,000 books of the Protestant faith to be burned in public. A few days' visit, and they were once more on the way for Vienna and home. Ferdinand's tongue had never ceased to chatter. There were so many interesting details to report to the mother, and when Vienna was reached, it did seem as if the child never could settle down to life in the city, after his splendid rambles about the open country, wondering where he willed. "Father," he remarked after some days at home, "we did not go to Moravia. We visited all the provinces except that." "Yes, it is true," replied his father, "but, we lingered longer than we intended, and Teresa is due to arrive shortly. We shall have to reserve Moravia for another vacation time. I think you will not find the customs there very different, however, from those of Bohemia. But I should like to have you see Olmütz, the ancient capital of Moravia, where our Emperor Franz Joseph was proclaimed king." End of chapter 10. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. Chapter 11 of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Vienna. With the arrival of Teresa Runkel, busy days followed. Visits to the Prater, which Emperor Joseph II had dedicated to the public for a playground and recreation park, to the Capuchin Church, where lie the remains of the imperial families from the time of Matthias I in 1619, and where the ill-starred Duke of Reichstadt, the only son of Napoleon of France, lies buried among his kinsfolks as well as his imperial mother, Marie Louise. And, best of all, there was the excursion to the castle of Luxembourg, just outside Vienna, one of the imperial chateaux, standing in the midst of a miniature island, which is reached by a tiny ferry boat, quite as though it were some ancient feudal castle with its moat, minus the drawbridge and portcullis. Here they were frightened nearly out of their senses while inspecting the dungeons, at hearing an automaton chained to the wall shake its cumbersome fetters, as if he were some prisoner living out his days in the hopelessness of the dungeon. But Herr Müller quieted the alarms of the young girl by explaining the pleasantry of the custodian, who gives his visitors thrills, which is what they really come for, as he says. "I wish you could be here for the ice carnival, Teresa," said Ferdinand, after one busy day's sightseeing. "It's wonderful, with the lake all lit up by electric lights and lanterns, and tiny booths dotted here and there, and skaters in their furs and gay gowns. Can't you manage to come at Christmas time?" "I should love to," she replied. "I'll write and ask Father Franz, if I may. And maybe Mother will let us go to one of the masked balls," the lad said, half hesitatingly, for he knew this would indeed be a privilege. "Scarcely yet, Ferdinand. Children do not attend balls. But there are countless other festivities for children, which would delight Teresa much more than a masked ball, at which she could but look on. It is far better to be a participant, isn't it, my dear?" "Oh, much," answered the child politely. Nevertheless, she did wish she might see the ball. A few days later Ferdinand and his mother drove the Austrian girl to the railroad station, where she was met by the sister, who would conduct her and others to the convent. At the conductor's call, "Einsteigen!" the doors of the train were fastened, and Ferdinand waved farewell to his little friend, through whose childish head flashed visions of a merry Yuletide to come, passed in the home of her friends, with dances and parties, and skating, and endless merriment. End of chapter 11. Recording by Julia Niedermeyer. End of Our Little Austrian Cousin by Florence E. Mendel.